Understanding Libertarianism and Freedom. This episode is going to be an advanced deconstruction of the ideology of libertarianism, and that is a very important first point, is that libertarianism is an ideology, and it suffers from many of the same problems that any ideology suffers from. We'll be talking about that a lot more as we go here. Warning to any of you libertarians in the audience, this is going to hurt. Your ideology will get savaged and completely destroyed here, but there is a silver lining in that if you stop being ideological, just stop and decide to actually think through your worldview with an open mind, and this takes a lot of open-mindedness to understand some of the advanced points that I'll be presenting here, this will transform you. It will not only transform your ideas, naive ideas about community, society, and government and politics, but perhaps even more importantly than that, it will transform your view of mankind and your relationship and role within humanity and society. Because your current worldview, your libertarian worldview, is holding you back from a deeper understanding of reality and achieving higher levels of development for yourself personally. So this issue goes, please understand, it goes way beyond politics. I've spent a few years now studying carefully, especially American politics, studying all the stuff that's been going on, trying to dissect it, deconstruct it from a sort of a higher perspective, from an existential, metaphysical, epistemological perspective, to see what the confusion is about. And I've watched a lot of debates about with libertarians arguing for their worldview. I've listened to many, many, many of their points. And over the time, as I was listening to it, I was compiling a list of all the errors that they're making, metaphysically, epistemologically, spiritually, and so forth, which is creating problems in their worldview that's getting them stuck. And so this is a very popular ideology that's in vogue these days. You just absorb it from your culture if you grow up in America or other places like that. And you don't know that you've absorbed this ideology. It becomes like a virus that gets lodged in your mind, and it starts to metastasize like a cancer. And it creates a lot of collective problems, but it also holds you back personally, individually. So we'll be addressing all of that. My critiques here of libertarianism, I want you to understand, they're not coming from an ideological place, the way that many critiques that you might find on YouTube are. This is a very sophisticated analysis that's going to be bringing in advanced concepts from various fields, from spirituality to non-duality to metaphysics to epistemology to moral philosophy and so forth. You probably have not heard this level of depth of analysis about libertarianism or even society or government ever in your life, and you probably won't find it anywhere else on YouTube or on the internet. So just appreciate what's here. If you can stick with me for the next 2 hours, your whole view of reality will change if you're a libertarian. So let's begin at the very beginning. Let's kind of ground our conversation here. What are we talking about? What is libertarianism? Here's a quote to get us started from Wikipedia. Quote, "Libertarianism is a political philosophy and movement that upholds liberty as a core principle. Libertarians seek to maximize political freedom and autonomy, emphasizing individualism, freedom of choice, and voluntary association. Libertarians share a skepticism of authority and state power, but they diverge on the scope of their opposition to the existing economic and political systems." End quote. That's a very good starting point. Of course, it's rather vague, but we get to see a little bit of what's going on here. And of course, it's important to note that not all libertarians are the same. There's diversity in their perspectives. Some are really anti-government, some are only mildly anti-government. So we'll be covering the full range here. But even though libertarians especially like to cite that, oh, my libertarianism is different from some other libertarianism, maybe it's not so different. There are some core pillars that I've identified by listening to a lot of libertarians debate and argue their points, which sort of form the core or the heart of their worldview. So here are these pillars. Most libertarians believe, whether explicitly but especially implicitly, that freedom is an absolute good. They sort of treat freedom as the ultimate goal. to maximize freedom at all cost. They also generally tend to think that taxation is immoral, or they just say outright that taxation is theft. They also are big on personal responsibility. Fundamentally, they believe that personal responsibility is what will solve most of society's problems, and that if something is wrong in society, it's usually because there's a lack of personal responsibility. People make bad choices, and then, of course, they have to reap what they sow and live with their consequences. So, for example, a libertarian might believe that, well, did you get cancer, but you didn't have health insurance in America, for example? Well, whose fault is that? Is that our entire collective system's fault? The government's fault? Or is it your fault for not getting a good job with health insurance that covered you because you should have foreseen that you might have gotten cancer? And so therefore it's your fault. And so tough luck. If you get cancer, you don't have health insurance, you might die, but that's because you didn't take personal responsibility. And that's correct. That's how society should work. That's what they believe. They also tend to believe that individualism is good while collectivism is bad. It's all about individual freedom, individual responsibility, individual rights, individualism. And that if we're selling any of that out to collectivism, that's somehow wrong, immoral, and is an infringement upon my individual freedoms. Who are you to tell me that I'm supposed to sacrifice for some collective when really we're all just individuals? They also tend to believe that the free market, this very special notion in their worldview called the free market, it plays a pivotal role in their worldview. They believe that this will solve all of social problems, or most social problems can be solved by the free market. So if we just stop interfering with the free market, which is what they think government is doing, if we just stop interfering and we let the free market play out naturally without any manipulation, then that will result in the best possible society, the least oppression, and the most freedom for everybody, and the most moral outcome. They believe that this special term they like to use, monopoly of force, or the use of force, is inherently immoral. Monopoly of force here means that, well, basically your government has a monopoly of force in the sense that they control the military, they control the police, and they will use these physical instruments of force to coerce you to follow the laws, to pay the taxes, and so forth. And since really, as an individual, we can't fight against that, in a certain sense, we've been enslaved by our government, by this idea of monopoly of force. And the libertarian views it such as, they have a view like this, where they say that any situation in which you come to me and you try to force me to do something is inherently immoral. Like if I have a farm and you come to my farm and you try to force me to give you half of my crop as tax, or you try to take part of my plot of land for yourself, or, something like this. Like you try to steal something from my property, you try to maybe rape my children. This would be a use of force that is inherently immoral and shouldn't exist. Libertarians, generally speaking, are very moralistic. They tend to have a strong sense of morality, and their sense of morality is not relativistic but objectivist, in the sense that they think that there are clear rights and wrongs in the world that are inherently part of, I guess, the fabric of the universe, where things like war, theft, maybe genocide, slavery, rape, these are immoral and absolute wrongs, that these are universals. We'll talk a lot more about that in a moment. They also have a strong notion of natural rights and personal property rights. They tend to believe that these are just inherent. Like when mankind was living in the pre-civilization era, in a more simpler time, people had personal property rights and those could be respected. Basically, generally speaking, we could know, this is my plot of land, that's your plot of land. And there are certain natural rights that we have. For example, the natural life, the right to life, the natural right to not get tortured, the natural right to be able to raise a family and to not get, our house robbed and these sorts of things. They tend to believe that regulations are bad because they infringe upon freedom, and that society will be better by removing all these needless bureaucratic regulations that are just getting so overblown today with big government. Speaking of which, they generally think that small government is better than big government. And so anything big government they basically don't like, because fundamentally they think like this: government can get very corrupt, and the bigger the government gets, the more corrupt it gets. So of course we want to reduce that to make it smaller. They tend to really be champions of free speech, and they tend to want unlimited free speech as much as possible. The less regulation, the better. Because supposedly the idea is that it's okay to have unlimited free speech because we've got a marketplace, this free market of ideas and philosophies. And so what will happen is just naturally people will come out into the public forum. They will discuss various philosophies and belief systems, and eventually the best ones, through some evolutionary market process, will win out. And all the bad ones will wither on the vine. And in general, I've noticed that libertarians tend to be very principled and idealistic, and more so principled and philosophical than they are utilitarian or pragmatic. So rather than asking the question of like, okay, how do we create the best government, and then try to find some answers by like reading some books or actually doing some tests in the real world, that sort of stuff. Rather than doing that, they tend to adopt ideals and principles of freedom and morality and so forth, and then they kind of reason backwards from that to say, okay, so if that is the ultimate objective, those are the ultimate principles, that's my worldview, then what kind of government will that sort of result in that fits my ideals? That's how they tend to think. So those are the core principles. We'll be addressing all of these in great detail. But I guess it should go without saying, but these principles are, the whole worldview, it's a worldview of libertarianism, is immature, it's juvenile, it's naive, it's arrogant, it's entitled, it's ahistorical, it's utopian, it's self-biased, it's ideological, it's got an inherent masculine bias to it, which is why you don't find as many female libertarians as male libertarians, and usually these male libertarians also tend to be sort of on the younger side. They tend to be white more than minorities, and there's important reasons for that, which we'll get to. And fundamentally, libertarians tend to be selfish. There's a fundamental, profound misunderstanding of how government, society, and community works, which is what we'll be discussing today. So if you're not a libertarian, this is still very valuable for you, because actually what we're talking about here is not libertarianism per se. We're talking about a deep understanding of what community is. What is community? What makes community work? This seems like a sort of a simple question, but it's not so simple at all. It's very complicated. It's very counterintuitive. It's tricky. So we have to be very open-minded about investigating how community works. We can't come into this saying like, well, I already know how it all works. No, how does it really work? What are all the nuances? And I guess to reach a hand out to you libertarians, because I empathize with you. Sometimes I'm kind of snarky and I will talk shit about your worldview. But on the other hand, I understand where you're coming from. I totally understand your worldview. I understand its appeal given your stage of development and consciousness. And, I understand that because when I was maybe 15 or 18 years old, in that range, late high school, early college, I had a libertarian streak to me as well. I was very rebellious, very independent, didn't like to follow authority, wanted to just be left alone, didn't really care about collectivist issues or, community, these sorts of things. I was just sort of a loner doing my own thing, and I just kind of wanted a political philosophy that just reflected my sort of sense of individuality in the world. Like, don't intrude on what I'm doing. Let everybody just do what they want to do. What's wrong with that? But I quickly outgrew that worldview once I started to study deeper these issues. And it might surprise you, but ironically, if they have that political compass where they have like two axes, one going up and down, one going left and right. One of the axes represents basically authoritarianism versus libertarianism. And then the other axis represents, what does it represent? I forget. Is it like economic values or something like that? Anyways, so on that compass, I took the test not that long ago, and I came out, my libertarian score is very high. Now, of course, that's sort of a different definition of what libertarian means, but like in general, I'm very pro individual freedoms. That's very important. So I'm not completely discounting that, and I'm not some authoritarian here who's sitting here arguing for some tyrannical or monarchical style of government. I think that, for example, what's going on in China and in Russia, sort of the dictatorial and authoritarian tendencies in those countries, and in Brazil and other places around the world right now, that's very problematic and it's unsustainable. So that's not what I'm arguing for. So just be careful not to immediately dismiss my critiques simply because you feel threatened that this contradicts your worldview. And also, I should point out that many of the points that I'll be making here will also apply to anarchism. That's also one of those ideologies that can be aligned with libertarianism, or it can be separate. It varies. There are right-wing versions of anarchism. There are left-wing versions of anarchism. But anarchists are also generally sort of on this idea that, well, if we get rid of the state, if we minimize the government, then we can live in a more sort of peaceful, flat hierarchy community, which will be more like in tune with nature and all this sorts of stuff. All right. Oh yeah, I remembered. So on that political compass, up and down was like libertarianism, and then left and right was actually just left and right, whether you're liberal or conservative. So my views, just to be clear, I'm very liberal and I'm also very libertarian, both. I fall into that quadrant. But anyways, here we go. So point number one, and this is perhaps the most important point, and this is actually something that you will benefit from even if you have no interest in politics or libertarianism, is freedom. What is freedom? Libertarians fundamentally misunderstand freedom. And not just libertarians, but many others as well fundamentally misunderstand freedom. Freedom, you need to understand, we're getting to the actual metaphysics of freedom. This is deep stuff right off the bat. So brace yourselves. The metaphysics of freedom. See, most people have never actually bothered to sit down and to contemplate and think deeply about what freedom is. What they've done is they've gotten some ideas from external sources, some viruses that have gotten stuck in their minds, an ideology about freedom. And they have developed this sort of myth of what freedom is. True freedom is an extremely radical thing, and it is not some absolute good, at least not from the perspective of a life form or an individual human. What is freedom in its most abstract sense? It's complete lack of limitation of any kind. Going even further, when we get to the actual substance of reality itself, to the molecular level, you might say, freedom at this level is actually, it's a freedom from form even. So what I'm saying is that to be totally free, you have to be completely unlimited in every possible way. You can't be any particular way. That's the cost. There's an existential trade-off here between degrees of freedom and having any kind of material, concrete existence whatsoever. Think about this. For a cat to be a cat, it has to be a cat, and it can't be a dog or a lion or a human or a kangaroo or an alien or a rock or a tree or something else. You might say, well, yeah, Leo, that's obvious. So what? Wait a minute. Really think this through. Not so what. What that means is that if you want to incarnate as a cat, you're committed to the limitations of that form. So a cat has 4 legs. A cat has a certain size. It has a tail. It has eyes. It has ears. All of these are limitations. Of course, there are also possibilities because the ears can pick up certain sounds. The eyes can pick up certain frequencies of light, radiation. The legs can allow the cat to jump to certain heights. The tail can allow it to, balance while it's running and many other things like this. So there's always trade-offs, though, when you have a particular form of a cat. A cat can't fly. A cat can't dive underwater. A cat can't do calculus. There's a million things that a cat can't do. And yet, of course, you can say, well, let's remove some of those restrictions. Okay, well, we'll remove some of those restrictions and we'll turn the cat into a human. Okay, so now it seems like, well, does that give the cat more ability if it's a human now? Well, of course, if you turn a cat into a human, now you completely forget that it was even a cat. It's just a human. Okay, it's a human, but then human has its own limitations. A human can't jump as high as a cat. Human doesn't have fur, so it gets cold more easily outside in the wintertime than a cat would. A human can't meow like a cat. A human doesn't have as sensitive smell as a cat, maybe not as sensitive ears as a cat, and many other things. But of course, humans have many other great opportunities. We might have better color vision. We have bigger brains. We can do math. We can do all sorts of interesting things that cats can't do. So who's better? Is a human better than a cat? Well, of course not. There are different trade-offs here. So what I want you to notice is that every form has its own trade-offs. And a form is anything. It doesn't have to be an animal. It doesn't have to be a sentient being. It could be a rock. It can be a tree. It could be a car. It doesn't matter. But whatever it is, it's got its limits. Now you say, okay, but I want freedom. I want total freedom. Because this is what the libertarian is sort of fooling himself into thinking that he wants. Is total, absolute freedom. Because absolute freedom is an absolute good. Well, but do you realize what that means? Absolute freedom means that you have no form whatsoever. Because if you're a cat, you're limited. If you're a human, you're limited. If you're a rock, you're limited. If you're a car, you're limited. If you're the earth, you're limited. If you're the entire universe, you're still limited. The only truly unlimited thing is emptiness or form. Emptiness or formlessness. This is otherwise known as pure consciousness or infinity, absolute infinity. Such a thing does exist, believe it or not. In fact, it is the thing which is aware of everything in your experience. It is your ultimate fundamental nature. But this is not conducive to survival as a living being. When we're talking about the domain of politics, we're talking about survival. Community is about collective survival, and your individual life is about individual survival. These are relative concerns which are separate from the absolute, at least for the sake of our discussion here. So what needs to be understood about freedom is that freedom will kill you if you get it in the absolute form. If you could press a button right now, and this button will give you absolute freedom, and you are stupid enough to press that button, you have to realize you're going to be dead. You're going to be gone. You're going to turn into a cloud of vapor, and even that will dematerialize, and you'll be pure nothing. There will be nothing left. There will not be society. There will not be your body. There will not be your mind. There will not be a planet. There will not be a universe. There will be nothing. That's absolute freedom. Now, if you want something to exist, something material, then we're going to talk about limitation. And now everything that we're talking about is going to be within the domain of limitation. The only question will be, what kind of limitations? What are the trade-offs and consequences of different choices in limitation that we decide upon? So if you want to exist as a human, you're committing yourself to a certain set of limitations. If you want to live in a certain society that allows for certain things to happen, like it has roads, it has bridges, it has an electrical grid. Those are all limitations. And we have to work with those limitations. So see, freedom is very counterintuitive, deeply counterintuitive, because when you allow for total freedom, let's now talk about, not in the absolute sense, but total freedom within the limited material world. And we're going to be talking about here planet Earth and the humans that live on it. So let's rewind the clock to maybe 10 or 100,000 years ago, where most humans were just living out in the forests, in the wilderness by themselves in small tribes. And you say, okay, yeah, they were free. Everybody was free back then. That's sort of the myth of freedom. But again, be very careful here. What freedom means in this context is that when you have freedom, freedom doesn't just mean that you're going to get all the good stuff that you want. Freedom means that others are also free to do what they want to do. So you see the problem here? We have different agents in the world. We have you, we have me, we have others. They're all agents. All these agents, humans, they have their own ideas, opinions, worldviews, and they have their own survival needs. They're surviving in different ways depending on what they need for their survival. Now, of course, we share certain things in common, like food, water, air that we need, and so forth. But even with food, we have different needs as far as what kind of food we need. Certain people will die with certain kind of food that others won't. So when you have all these different agents, here's sort of the crux of the problem of government, is how do you get all these agents to work together peacefully so that it doesn't turn into total barbarism and devilry? How? Because each one of them has their own opinion about how they should live their life and how others should live their life. See, it's not just that I have my own opinions about how I should live my life. No. It goes way beyond that. I have opinions about how my children should live their life. I have opinions about how my family should live their life. I have opinions about how women should live their life, how men should live their life, how gay people should live their life, or maybe they shouldn't even exist. Maybe that's my opinion. How black people should live their life, or white people, or what Asian people, or whatever. And so, see, it's not just that we're just controlling our own behavior, but then we have expectations for how we want others to behave as well. And we try to boss them around. And when they don't behave the way we want them to behave, we say, hey, stop. You're not doing what I want you to do. But you see the problem? We're already starting to get into the problem of relativity, which we'll be discussing in great detail in a minute here. But the relativity here is that I want you to do things my way, and you want me to do things your way. So how do we adjudicate which way things should be done? Who's to say which is the right way to do things? This is precisely why libertarians need to rely very strongly on a notion of objective morality. They need that notion so they can appeal to it to say, Leo, yes, maybe you're right, but there's this universal overarching set of morals that all of us generally agree to and should obey, such as don't kill other people unless it's in self-defense. Don't take any aggressive action. Don't force people to do things. Don't steal their property. Don't rape their children, and so forth. We can all agree on that. That's kind of how they think. But the problem, of course, is that we can't agree on that. If we could agree on that, then government would be so easy, and then libertarians might be right. Then we could live in a very flat hierarchy with little government, and things would work pretty well because we all are on the same page. But we're not all on the same page. That's the problem. And we'll get into that in a minute here in more detail, the morality and the relativity of how this works. Because I know you libertarians are really, really sensitive about this point. When I bring up and start to question your moral system, the objectivity of it, and start to imply that morality might be relativistic, this is a no-go zone for you, because this is the attacking the very heart and foundation of your worldview, and so you're going to be extremely resistant to what I'm saying here. Just I urge you to keep an open mind, because you are wrong about this, and if you just keep an open mind, I will be able to show you why you're wrong. You are wrong. But in the meantime, you're not going to want to hear it. So just be careful with how your own mind kind of has its biases and preferences and discounts what I say. So here's what you got to understand about freedom. Freedom is the freedom to oppress people. That's what freedom means. If I am totally free, that means I am free to kill you, to enslave you, to steal your stuff, to rape you, to do genocide on your people, and to do whatever I want. That's freedom. Be careful here because your mind is going to want to deny this. Because your mind has construed freedom as something that's good and positive. It's an absolute good. So now when I tell you that freedom also includes the freedom to oppress others, now you're caught in this cognitive dissonance situation where on the one hand, you know freedom is an absolute good, but on the other hand, here I am telling you that all this bad stuff comes from freedom. How can this be? So surely Leo must be wrong because freedom is an absolute good. We've all been taught that, right? Well, here's where you have to stop parroting what you've been taught and you have to start to question ideas in your mind. Where do they come from? Are they really true? Is freedom really an absolute good? If you contemplate just even for a little bit about freedom, it's quite obvious. It's obvious as day that true freedom means not just my freedom to do good stuff, like raise a family and run a business and have a farm and own property and all this. It means oppression. I get to oppress you. I get to enslave you. Of course, so do you to me. I'm not saying that I'm the only one who has these freedoms. If we're talking about true freedom, that means I have this freedom and you have this freedom. So then you see the problem. Who's going to win out? Are my freedoms going to trump your freedoms? Or are your freedoms going to trump my freedoms? What happens when two different agents, sentient agents with different survival agendas, different worldviews, come together and now they're in conflict because their freedoms are now interpenetrating and interfering with one another? How is that situation going to be handled? That's what I really want to press you to contemplate as a libertarian. Those are the really tricky edge cases upon which all of government is built. It's easy to talk about absolute freedom when people are living far away from each other, somewhere in the rural countryside where each one of us has a 100-acre plantation. We raise our family on it. We rarely see other people. We don't have neighbors, or if we do have neighbors, our neighbors look like us, same race, same ethnicity, same general worldview, same moral system, same religion, same ethical code, all this sorts of stuff. And we get along and there's basic trade and this sort of stuff happens and it's sort of peaceful. You can kind of imagine this sort of, idyllic mode of human existence. But anywhere in the history of mankind where there was such a mode of existence, there was also oppression. There was also those people who didn't agree with those moral systems. There were people who were different from outside, who might want to come in and pillage your farmland, take your land, take your crops, take your children, take your wife, rape them, enslave them, force you to work for them, tax you every season, and so on. And now here, of course, the libertarian says, well, Leo, of course, I'm not stupid. I understand that. Of course, human history had a lot of this kind of oppressiveness in it, which is precisely why we as libertarians believe that that's immoral and that's wrong and that violates, Leo, that violates the libertarian philosophy. So what are you talking about? What I'm talking about is that you yourself don't understand the consequences of your philosophy. You have a rose-colored, glassed view of your own philosophy. You haven't actually thought through the consequences. What I'm describing to you now is libertarian in action. Because if we have a bunch of farmers just living, we have 1,000 farmers living across a giant plot of land, and they all are able to get along peacefully, and they're all able to divide the land equally and stay off each other's property and respect each other's rights and so forth. This is sort of what you envision as a libertarian. But then what happens? Think of this. What happens when one of those gets a little bit more ambition, a little bit of ego, and says, why am I toiling away in the fields of my little farm for 10, 20, 30 years until I die, working from dawn till dusk on these crops and barely scraping by, barely making a living? Why am I doing this when what I could do is I could go to my friends, to 5 of my neighboring farmer friends, and we will create a collective, a syndicate or a cabal. We will create a syndicate, or we'll form a pact where we agree that we're going to be working together to conquer all the other farmers. And if we succeed in this, they will all be working for us, and we won't have to farm another day in our life. We'll just be collecting dividends. We'll also gather the most beautiful women to get as our concubines and wives, and other resources that are available out there. We'll pillage them and steal them, or we'll find some way to squeeze those who are less powerful than us. Because, how can one individual farmer fight against 5 other farmers who have formed a collective against him? The only way is if he is exceedingly rich and wealthy already, such that maybe he can hire some mercenary army to defend him. But if that's not available, or he's not that rich, then his only other option is to also form a collective. So I form a collective here with 5 farmers. He now has to form a collective of 10 farmers to overpower these 5 farmers. And then who's going to win out? Well, now it's an arms race. Whoever's stronger, faster, more ruthless, more vicious. All of this that I'm describing is happening within a free marketplace. There's nobody setting any rules. There's no government here. It's just individual people, farmers. So if farmers decide they want to coordinate as a group, nothing is stopping them. Who's going to stop them? And after all, is it morally wrong for 5 farmers to come together and start to coordinate towards some larger goal, towards some larger project? Maybe at first this starts off as just not a vicious campaign of domination and warlording and marauding, but it could start off as like the 5 farmers come together and they just want to build some more advanced irrigation system that will benefit all those 5 farmers. Well, okay, what's wrong with that? Are you going to prevent them from doing that as a libertarian? No, of course you're going to allow that. There's nothing to prevent it, so of course you're going to. And of course they will do it, because when humans come together and work in a coordinated way, they can accomplish amazing things that enhance their survival. It's not simply that if you take 5 farmers and combine them together, that they will produce the same amount of crop output as they would as 5 individuals. There's going to be a cumulative geometric effect. If we get 5 farmers together and they start to coordinate all their labor together, then they might be able to put out 10 times more crop yield than they would if they worked individually. Because they can build some roads, irrigation canals, they can share technology, they can share all sorts of knowledge and wisdom about how to do this. They can start to specialize in different roles, create a little city or a little town, and then they're much more effective. And so, of course, the free market will drive towards that. But as soon as that happens, notice what happens. Now, this little town has flourished of 5 farmers. Let's say it's a little village. They've built up their irrigation canals, their roads, and all this sorts of great stuff. And they've gotten wealthy. They've built a lot of wealth. They have fabulous farms, fabulous crops, beautiful houses that they've built up through all this labor. All the other farmers who did not coordinate, now they look at those farmers and say, oh, wow, look at that. There's so much wealth over there. There's beautiful people. There's resources. There's animals, there's crops, there's labor, there's roads and canals. Wow, that's amazing. We want that for ourselves. But of course, people are inherently lazy and selfish. So while some of them might coordinate and then build one of those for themselves from scratch, that takes a lot of work. It's a lot easier for them to coordinate together, build a military, come attack these guys who are completely defenseless, and just steal all their stuff. And so that's exactly what happens. And notice that that is the free market. That is true freedom. Don't deny that. You're going to want to say that, no, Leo, that goes against my morals. Your morals don't mean shit to those people who have different morals. That's what you need to get through your thick skull. Other people don't live by your morals. It's not good enough when a serial killer comes to kidnap your children for you to tell him, oh, well, but what about our morals? What about the individual right to life and to happiness? And what about, the fact that use of force against others is inherently immoral? The serial killer doesn't give a shit. He's going to kidnap and rape your children and slit their throats. That's what a serial killer does. That's the reality that we're dealing with when we're trying to construct a community. See, we're not dealing with angels here. We're dealing with selfish, ruthlessly selfish people. And by the way, you as a libertarian don't think you're above this somehow. Like I'm saying that, oh, well, libertarians are up here. They have these great morals and they're good people and angels. And then there's all the devils and serial killers and rapists over here. And now the problem really is that the libertarians need to somehow, teach the devils how to rise to their level. No. It's way worse than that. What I'm telling you is that you as a libertarian, the hypocrisy of your position is that actually you yourself are a selfish fucking devil, yet you don't admit it. You only think you're an angel. Actually, the way that you behave is very, very selfishly. And much of what you call freedom is really just a mask and nothing more than a facade that you put up to avoid reflecting on your own selfishness. The whole concept of freedom is not really about freedom for everybody in some egalitarian sense, even though you like to paint it that way. In practice, what freedom means for you is freedom for you to do exactly the shit that you think you want to do that fits your survival agenda. That's really what you mean when you say freedom as a libertarian. You don't really give a shit about the freedom of others. You care about your own freedom. And when push comes to shove, you are going to do what is necessary to increase your own freedom at the cost of others. That's what you do. That's what egos do. And we'll be talking a lot more about egos here in a moment. So see, this idea that freedom is an absolute good is complete nonsense. In the context of forming a society, what we're really talking about is making strategic choices about certain limitations and restrictions and regulations such that we reduce the horror of unlimited freedom. Unlimited freedom is what exists in the animal kingdom. If you want the closest thing to a free marketplace, go to the jungle. There's your free marketplace. There's no government, there's no rules, but also notice there's no morality, and it's vicious as fuck. In the absence of laws and cultural norms, which is really what you mean by morality. In the absence of these, which had to be invented and developed, in the absence of these, you have, how do you arbitrate between the survival agenda of two different organisms? You have, let's say, you have a snake and you have a mouse in the jungle. The mouse has its own survival agenda. It wants to, raise its family and do mice stuff, congregate with other mice and find mouse food and so forth. And then the snake needs to live, and for that, it needs to eat mice. And it wants to reproduce. So you see, we have a conflict of interest here. Conflict of agendas. So who's going to win? How is that decided? It's not decided through morals. It's not decided through ethics. It's not decided by some government power. It's only decided between the two of them by seeing who can overpower who or who can outsmart who. If the mouse is clever enough to spot the snake and not even approach the snake, then the snake will starve to death. And if the mouse is stupid enough and careless enough to walk by a snake and the snake strikes it and eats it, then the mouse and his family dies. It's not good. It's not bad. It's not evil. It's not immoral. It's the free market. That's freedom. The problem, though, is that it's extremely vicious. Who on earth would want to live in that kind of environment? On the one hand, it seems kind of cool, like total freedom. I'm just going to, I'm in the jungle. There's no government. Nobody's taxing me about anything. I don't have to fill out my, annual tax forms. You know how annoying that is. I don't have to follow any kind of regulations. I can do whatever I want. Yes, but so can anybody else. And therein lies the problem. Because you can't even imagine the sort of horrors that somebody else might do to you in order to gain a survival advantage for themselves, their family, and their children. You can't even imagine the horrors. And it's because of this that libertarian societies do not exist. Libertarianism is an ahistorical philosophy. There has not been a single libertarian government that has survived. I mean, maybe they existed, but if they did, they didn't last very long, and you won't find much evidence of it in the history books. They don't exist because they can't exist, because nobody wants to live in that kind of society. In a sense, libertarianism was our starting point as a civilization. If you rewind the clock 100,000 years, before there were cities, maybe even before there were proper towns and even villages, where it was really, really simple, just like, caveman days. Small tribes. That's probably the closest thing you'll get to libertarianism, but there was clan warfare, tribal warfare. It wasn't all sweet and idyllic. It was bloody. One tribe would fight another tribe. If you've read any anthropological or historical documentation about how tribes live, actually, not as some mythologized, idealized, romanticized version, but how tribes actually live. They're extremely territorial. They're violent. They've got weapons, bows and arrows and clubs and things like that, and they will fight ruthlessly with neighboring tribes, and they will hold grudges against neighboring tribes for generations and hundreds of years. They will kidnap each other's children and wives. They will seek revenge and retribution because there will be blood feuds between these different tribes. Maybe 20 years ago, you kidnapped my daughter. So then, I've been biding my time, and then my ancestors will come and they will kill your grandmother as retribution for you kidnapping my daughter, and so forth. This is very normal stuff. This is business as usual for tribes. So you can see it's a ruthless existence because there is no higher moderating power. There's nobody you can go to say but that tribe, they kidnapped my daughter, and that's wrong. So we should, stop them from doing that in the future because I have other daughters. I don't want them to get hurt too. See, normally in an advanced society, you would go to police or you would go to some court, and they would adjudicate these things for you, and they would step in on your behalf, and they would stop any sort of shenanigans from happening. They would stop people from stealing your property and invading you and whatever else. But for that to happen, that requires restriction, regulation, requires monopoly of force. Because here, the state, in this case, has a military, they have a police, they have a court system, all of this stuff. This is a monopoly of force. So what we've done in advanced societies is we've actually relinquished certain freedoms that we used to have. so that we can get a more peaceful, ordered, cohesive society. It's sort of like we come together and we agree, like let's say in warfare, it's interesting that you might think, well, warfare is the perfect example of unregulated activity. It's ruthless, people just slaughtering and killing each other indiscriminately. But in advanced society, we actually have rules for warfare that we've agreed to. There are certain like Geneva Convention protocols and rules, that treaties that have been signed against using nuclear weapons, against using chemical weapons, biological weapons, mustard gas, and even certain kind of bullets are banned from use on the battlefield. Because there are certain bullets these days that are just like, especially inflict a lot of suffering. I don't know what they're called, hollow points or whatever. I'm not a bullet expert, but there are certain munitions, certain kinds of explosives, certain kinds of like napalm and stuff that is just horrific beyond simply getting the normal sort of evils of the battlefield. These are like an additional layer. So my point is that we have come together, and because we've had centuries of ruthless war where people were getting napalmed and tortured and getting shot with crazy ammunition that maimed them and just destroyed everything, and gas and biological weapons, all this sort of stuff, and even nuclear weapons. We've had all this. We've seen the horrors of it, and collectively we've come together as enemies, as opposite sides. We've come together and we said, okay, I know I hate you, and I know you hate me, but at least together, even though we hate each other, and even though we know we're going to go to war sometime in the future, nevertheless, can you and I agree that we're not going to use nuclear weapons? Okay? Can we agree that we're not going to use napalm against each other? Okay. Can we agree that we're not going to torture each other's, captive prison? Okay. So at least we can agree on that. And that will at least mitigate some of the horror of survival. But this requires agreement. And then furthermore, how do you enforce the agreement if one side decides to cheat? What happens if we agree to this, but then secretly I'm torturing your prisoners when I capture them? Well, you see, the only solution to that is for you to start torturing my prisoners, because that lets me get a taste for how bad it is. And then we can come back to the table, because, if I'm torturing yours and you're torturing mine, we can come back to the table maybe in 10 years and we can agree, okay, we've both tortured enough of each other's prisoners. Can we agree to stop? But then you tell me, well, how can we agree if we agreed last time 10 years ago, but you cheated? And what am I going to say? I'm going to say, well, yeah, I did. I cheated. Or I'm going to deny it. See? But at some point, we have to get to a point where we can come together and coordinate and not cheat on each other. That's difficult to do. This is the problem of government in a nutshell. But you see what's happening here. You think that freedom is this absolute good, but notice what's happening. If we come together and we sit down at a negotiating table and we agree to restrict nuclear weapons, napalm, and mustard gas, and whatever else, bad bullets and so forth, we are restricting freedom. That's not freedom. That's regulation. That's restriction. That's limitation. And in this situation, it's a good. It's a net positive. It allows for peace. It reduces suffering. So this example alone completely throws a wrench in the works of libertarian philosophy. This is just one example. Now, you need to extrapolate this example out into all of its different forms. It doesn't just happen with arms deals at the negotiating table between nations. This happens all across society, all across community. We create strategic restrictions and limitations and regulations, otherwise known as laws, so that we can adhere to those laws, and these laws are designed not to take away our freedom. Nobody sits down to design a law and says, well, I have too much freedom on my hands. Let me create a law that will take it away from me. No, nobody says that. What happens is that we start from a position where we have so much freedom that all sorts of chaos and devilry runs rampant. We feel it so much. It hurts us so deeply when it touches our own family, our own children, our own health, our own lives. Our own communities, our own nations get destroyed and savaged, and genocide happens. We experience all this slavery. We experience all that, and we say, okay, enough. I'm fucking sick of it. I am willing to surrender some of this freedom for a couple of laws that will just tell people, like, don't enslave others, don't rape others, don't use mustard gas, etc. So you would actually be insane and suicidal not to accept some of these restrictions. Literally, it's suicide not to accept these restrictions. Because the odds that you'll get killed from a lack of restrictions are very high. You see, one of the problems that libertarians face is that libertarianism is a new philosophy. This is not some philosophy that existed 100,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, or even 100 years ago. Libertarianism is like 70 years old, 80 years old, I don't know. It basically started with Ayn Rand. This is a philosophy that originated as a reaction to things that were happening in society back then, during Ayn Rand's time. It's already built upon a deep, deep, deep foundation of civilization and government that works and that creates relative peace and security for people. The mistake that libertarians make is that they don't think deeply enough through history. They don't kind of like connect the dots to see that we had to build ourselves up massively. We had to build up all this bureaucracy and infrastructure to get to the point where we're at today, where now you have the luxury of sitting in your own house as an individual, ranting and raving on some online forum about how you need more freedom and how the government is taking away your freedom and how taxation is theft and all this sorts of stuff. You have no idea what survival was really like 1,000 or 2,000 years ago before serious government. You had no idea of the horrors and evils that existed. So in a sense, the libertarian is taking for granted so much. The libertarian is taking for granted all of the luxuries and benefits that the restriction, regulation, and laws and monopoly of force have provided to him. And it is usually a him. If you were to start life over again, and you were given a choice before you incarnated into this world, between living in a totally free society where anything goes, and you're completely free, and then you're living like a caveman, or you live in today's society with internet, airplanes, nightclubs, hotels, air travel, space travel, video games, the internet, movies, and all this sorts of stuff. But you're very restricted. You have to pay taxes. You have to file government forms. You have to go to the DMV, get a driver's license before you drive on the road, and you have to, pay taxes for your car every year, and you gotta get a smog check. There's regulations on the pollution that your car can create, is allowed to create. You gotta, pay fines if your car is polluting too much, and you gotta follow orders of police if they stop you. If you're driving too fast on the road, police will stop you. You have to then pay them money. So if you had a choice between which one you would want to live in, you would always choose this one. Always, always. If you knew the horrors of this one over here, you would always choose this. And that is why there are no libertarian societies, and there basically never will be. Because everyone always chooses this. Because when they choose this, if out of stupidity they do choose this, they suffer from it so quickly that they quickly revert back, and then they turn this into this. They create it because of how horrible this is. But there's a trap here, is that once your ancestors worked really hard to move us away from the evils that existed in total freedom in the free market, they move us to a restricted market, to regulation and to laws. They built that up, and then generations and thousands of years pass, and then children are born into this environment. Now they take it for granted. See, this is what you are doing as a libertarian. You're taking for granted because you're sitting on this privileged position with all the luxuries that have been created by the structure of government and regulation and law and all this, monopoly of force. You're at the same time, the hypocrisy of it is that you're benefiting from all the fruits of that without realizing that the fruits came from those structures. And yet what you're trying to do now is you're trying to undermine and destroy those structures by trying to deregulate everything and to say that taxation is theft. And you're trying to get back to this place, but you're so stupid you don't understand what you're actually doing and what the consequences of that will be. And then you're frustrated why everybody around you isn't on board with you, why the government isn't, full of libertarians. Well, the reason it isn't is because it doesn't work. The people don't want it. Even if you were able to, seize control of the government with some radical libertarians and you were trying to make this libertarian worldview a reality, you would quickly get overthrown and killed by your fellow citizens, because once they got a taste of the consequences of your policies and deregulation and lack of laws, that would be so threatening to the survival of their children and their family that they would kill you. They would rather kill you than follow you into hell, this hell of absolute freedom. See, most people, fortunately, are not so ideological as to just want absolute freedom as an absolute good. Most people, what they want is they want security. They want their survival needs met. They want luxuries like entertainment, travel, cars, roads, the internet, and so forth. And the only way you can get these things is through a highly coordinated, regulated, carefully ordered infrastructure and bureaucracy, which orders the actions of thousands and millions of individual agents such that they can live peacefully together, so that they can coexist. Got that? We still haven't even scratched the surface of this yet. There's so much more that needs to be said. What you need to understand is that oppression is relative to identity. There is no such thing as oppression in the absolute sense. What qualifies as oppression is relative to what you identify as. So, for example, if you identify as a white Southerner in the colonial times, 200 years ago, you have a big plantation, you have a certain worldview of your race as being superior, and part of your survival agenda is that you need your plantations managed, and you sure as hell are not going to do it in the hot sun. So you import some slaves to do it for you. Do you, as the slave owner, consider yourself as oppressing the slaves? Of course not. Of course not. Now you might say, well, but the slave owners are just in denial. Everybody knows that slavery is wrong and oppressive. No, that's where you're wrong. That's the whole problem, is that everybody does not know and does not agree that slavery is wrong and oppressive. To the extent that they do, that's simply because we've built up the infrastructure and a consensus and a legal system and a bureaucratic system and an education system which teaches people that slavery is wrong and bad and you shouldn't do it because there's suffering that comes from it and it's oppressive and all this. This requires an education system. This requires a culture that teaches that. This culture did not exist 200 years ago. The culture of 200 years ago, 200 years is not a long time. The culture of 200 years ago mostly considered slavery as natural, even God ordained. You could go and find ministers and preachers that would talk about how God gifted the white man to rule over all the colored, the lesser colored people and the animals and so forth. You can find this. Now you can say, well, but they were deluded. No. You are deluded. You are deluded for thinking that slavery is some sort of absolute evil. It's not. Remember, total freedom means you can enslave people. Really think about this. 2,000 years ago, the idea that slavery was inherently wrong did not exist. It did not exist. Like, really, it did not exist. And when I say that, I don't just mean like, oh, well, it didn't exist and the people were idiots and they just didn't understand morality. And now we've gotten to the point where now we understand morality. We of course, we understand that it's wrong. And it always was wrong. No. It never was wrong, and it isn't wrong now. This is just a cultural norm. There is nothing that is stopping slavery other than the cultural norms and infrastructure and bureaucratic institutions that we have put in place to stop it. That's it. And of course, also this is part of the norms, is there's a culture. There's a cultural consensus where together today in 21st century society, if you're living in a developed part of the world, all of us agree that slavery is wrong. That's not because it is wrong. That's because we've seen the evils of allowing it and we've realized, it weighs heavy on our conscience. Even at some point, the slave owners had to say like, man, like whipping these slaves doesn't feel so good. And my fellow white people start to judge me for it. Like the Northerners who don't have slaves, they start to judge the Southerners who do. And then that doesn't feel good to the Southerners. Now there's a war. Of course, that's the Civil War in a nutshell. See? Oppression is relative to your identity. There is no such thing as absolute oppression. What counts as oppression is relative to your survival agenda, what you want out of life. And people have different notions of what oppression is. To somebody, to a libertarian, for example, given your worldview, you feel that taxation is oppression. But to most of us, we don't feel that because we realize that, yes, taxation is a bit of a pain in the ass. Nobody really likes to pay taxes, but also a mature individual understands that, yes, of course, I don't enjoy paying taxes, but it's not like this money is being stolen from me per se. This is money that I'm, in a sense, donating to create a better society because roads don't build themselves, militaries don't fund themselves, various other kinds of government programs don't fund themselves. Space travel doesn't fund itself. Now I hear you libertarians trying to make an argument that, oh, well, but if we just let businesses do it, then it can, like Elon Musk built SpaceX and that, Leo, that disproves your whole point because the private business can do it. The only reason Elon Musk was able to build SpaceX was because we have 10,000 years of fucking bureaucracy and infrastructure that have been developed, built through bloody wars. Hundreds of millions of people were killed, raped, enslaved, burned, and tortured at the fucking stake for 10,000 years to get us to this point where Elon Musk can now build a rocket to send some shit up into space. If you don't see that connection there, you're not using your head properly. There cannot be space travel without complex bureaucracy and regulation, military, court systems, police, fire departments, education systems, university systems, all funded by taxpayer money. I am not saying that it's impossible to have private space travel. Of course it's possible. In the future, we're going to have a lot more of it. But recognize, don't be so fucking arrogant as to take for granted the foundation upon which it is built that allows for it. You know, here's a very simple example for you. And I really encourage you libertarians who want to debate me and argue with me here to stop being philosophical for a moment and actually take a look at concrete examples of how stuff happens in society, because it'll quickly disabuse you of many of your mythical notions about how government works. For example, SpaceX. SpaceX cannot exist without Wall Street. Impossible. Now you might say, but Leo, SpaceX is not even traded on Wall Street. It's a private company. So why is Wall Street relevant here at all? Because how did Elon Musk fund SpaceX? The only way he was able to fund it is by the billions of dollars that he got from the sale of PayPal. How was PayPal sold? It was built up to go to IPO and to go on Wall Street, and the only reason Elon Musk got billions of dollars for it is because eventually they knew that this company would end up on Wall Street, where billions of dollars more, even than that, tens of billions would be generated. And so based on that, they gave him a few billion of his own. And then based on that, he funded SpaceX. Now you might wonder, well, so what? Wall Street, okay, big deal. Right, but Wall Street cannot exist without government regulation. Do you know the kind of shit that would happen on Wall Street if there was no government regulation, no laws against insider trading? Go read the history of stock markets and the kind of shit that happened in stock markets hundreds of years ago. Even just 50 years ago, before all this regulation was passed, there was massive regulation on Wall Street, and it's not nearly enough. There's still so many problems and so much corruption on Wall Street. But if you think that Wall Street would work better with less regulation, you're smoking crack. Stocks need to be heavily regulated because there's so much value to be gained from manipulating and lying to the public. You can publish fake press releases. You can manipulate your own stock prices. You can create fake companies and sell those stocks. Do pump and dump schemes and all sorts of scams. Like you could scam people out of billions of dollars without proper regulation and restriction. And if you think that situation can be managed simply by an appeal to moral principles and by an appeal to personal property rights and an appeal to don't be a dick on Wall Street. Like, how are you going to regulate Wall Street? The wolves on Wall Street, how are you going to regulate them? Government is how. Monopoly of force is how. There needs to be a military. There needs to be a police force. There needs to be a court system. There needs to be a legislature which passes the laws. There needs to be regulating agencies like the SEC and so forth, which go after these Wall Street wolves, keep them in check. If you think Wall Street is bad now, you have no idea how bad it would be without any of this infrastructure. It couldn't exist. It literally could not exist. So think really hard about what freedom really means. I want you to see that unlimited freedom is actually highly threatening to life and to self. And that really the ego, yourself, your own organism hates freedom. You hate freedom. Even if you have an ideology where you say you love freedom, actually you hate freedom. Because when you truly experience the effects of freedom on you, if someone comes and rapes your children, that's freedom. And when you experience that, you will hate freedom. You will understand the problem with freedom, unlimited freedom. And you will wish that there was someone you could go to, someone you could cry to who could help you in that situation. And from this, government is born. See, it's not rocket science. It's pretty common sense stuff. Without government, you would have enslavement. Did you know that slavery existed in basically all parts of the world and in all societies for thousands of years? Only recently, in the most developed societies with the most regulations, the biggest governments, only recently in the last couple hundred years have we been able to outlaw slavery. Why is that? Precisely because we need to build up so much infrastructure to get to the point where we could do it. So if you think that you're gonna roll back government to some sort of more simplified form, especially some of you anarchists, you're trying to literally roll back evolution to go back to an earlier stage in which enslavement was the norm, in which genocide was the norm. Do you understand that that's what you're actually proposing when you propose your anarchist ideas? I mean, of course, you're in denial about it. You're not going to admit to what you're doing because you haven't connected the dots. That's why in this whole conversation, I'm trying to guide you through the nitty-gritty, like, pathways of your own thoughts so you can see how your own thinking leads to absurdities and to all sorts of evil. Here's another example I want to run by you. Here's a claim, radical claim. Libertarians often like to argue that roads, for example, which are public in most places, that roads can be privatized with no problem. Private roads, they exist. We have toll roads. So why couldn't all roads be toll roads? And then we could save on taxes, and then that would be more freedom. Well, let's take a look at that. Here's my claim for you. I really challenge you to think about this. My claim is that it's impossible for a road to exist at all without a government. There cannot be a road without a government. Let's think this through. So imagine we roll back the clock 2,000 years or even maybe 5,000 years to a place where there were no roads yet, there were no cities yet. It was just little individual farmers living and surviving by themselves with no government yet. So they decide to build a road. Okay. How do you build a road? Let's say we want to build a decent size, 100 miles of road. It's not going to be concrete, but it's just going to be like 100 miles of road. Sort of a Roman style road, let's say. That's a pretty big project. How do you build it? Is a farmer going to be able to build it? No, impossible. Is his family going to be able to build it? Impossible. Are 5 farmers going to be able to build it? Impossible. 5 farmers and their families cannot build a 100-mile road. Nor do they even have a reason for building a 100-mile road. Why would they? Where are they going to go to? You need a much larger group of people. You probably need at least a city or a town of 1,000 or 10,000 to build such a road. So, assuming we've got these people, they build this road. Okay. But this road can only exist if it's maintained. So now they're committed to maintaining it. This road can only exist if it's defended against others who would come and want to destroy the road. So let's say our group, our town of 10,000 people decide to build our road, horizontally, east to west, 100 miles. And then some other group, neighboring group, decides to build a different road which goes north to south and intersects with our road. So what's going to happen at that intersection of roads? How is that traffic going to be managed? Maybe we can just come together and agree on it. But what if we have a difference of opinion? What if I say that, my road going north-south is more important than your road going east-west? What happens? Well, battle happens. See? How are you going to adjudicate that with your libertarian philosophy of no monopoly of force and just respecting individual property rights? So see, a libertarian would probably say something like, well, the first town who builds the road horizontally east-west, they get the first dibs on the property rights. So once you build a road this way, now you can't build a road the other way because it interferes with property rights. So now what the other people have to do is if these people build a road this way, these people have to build a road that goes around like this. But this is a pure absurdity. You see, nobody's going to be fucking building a road that goes around. They're just going to go straight through and they're going to dominate whatever's in between. There's going to be a battle because it's easier. It's actually more energy efficient to just have a battle than build a road that's twice as long that goes around. See? And after all, why should the first people get the rights? Where does it say, show me where there's a rule in the universe that says that if I build a road this way, that other people now are not allowed to build a road that way through my road. Where does it say that? It doesn't say that anywhere. It only exists in your mind. You see, that's the problem with you libertarians. You have a strong sense of morality, and then you expect everybody else to adhere to your morality, which of course is not real life. Real life is the exact opposite of that. Everybody else has their own sense of morality, which will conflict with yours, because in truth, your morality is not some objective universal thing. It is deeply selfish. Your morality is that which serves your survival and the survival of your family and the survival of your ideology. Your morality is not some, God-given thing. You invented your morality. Morality is a social invention, which has been invented by communities to help them to coexist and coordinate peacefully with each other without killing all of each other. That's the function of morality. It's a practical thing. So let's say, getting back to the road example, let's ignore the second road. Let's just say we have the original road. So simplify it. So we have the original road going east-west. It's 100 miles. They built it. They have to defend it. They have to maintain it. This takes energy. This takes a force. You need a police force to police this road. What happens if someone, let's say, throws a giant rock in the middle of the road? Someone has to come and clear it out. There also needs to be a punishment for doing this, because some people might want to blockade the road. See, some people, because this road now, once the road is built, it's valuable. And presumably that's why you built it in the first place. It allows you to travel faster, allows you to access points that you couldn't access before, so it has value. Now that it has value, see, people get clever. The ego gets clever. It wants to exploit all the value that exists. So some small band of people decide, this road is valuable. What if we blockade the road? Then we can prevent troops from going from one part of the countryside to the other. That will give us some survival advantage. Let's blockade the road. So you got to prevent them from doing that. Some police have to stop them. That means there has to be patrols along this road. Now you might say, but Leo, that's a violation of property rights, because hey, if you're putting rocks on my road, then you're violating my property rights, and that's immoral. But who gives a fuck? At this stage of human development, nobody cares about what's immoral. What they care about is survival. If it's going to save someone's life or allow them to feed their children, to place boulders in the middle of your road, they will do it. Or they can set up a little toll booth of their own. You see, I can get a couple of my guys, some big guys, I hire them, they get their guns and their machetes, and we set up a little toll booth at some point in the road. Everybody comes through, they have to pay us, a third of the goods that they're carrying, or we cut their heads off. That will inevitably happen unless there's some mechanism to prevent it. Don't you dare think that human goodness alone will prevent that from happening. No, there needs to be an enforcement of it. And then that enforcement itself, who's gonna control whether the enforcement is fair or not? You see, what happens if the troops who are patrolling, the police, let's say, who are patrolling that road, making sure that it doesn't get hijacked or blockaded, or something else bad happens on it? Who's going to police them? Because what if they get out of hand? What if they themselves decide to, we can set up our own toll booth on the road and charge everybody because we're the police. We got even more power than those bandits. They could do that. See? So there needs to be an even higher agency above the police that polices the police. Either a military or a court system or an independent agency or an internal affairs department of the police that reviews the police and so on. That roots out corruption and all sorts of possibilities for devilry and selfishness, because it will exist, because humans are selfish. So my point here being, I hope you can see, is that there cannot exist a road without a government. You might say, well, what about toll roads? Yes, you can have toll roads within the ecosystem that has been built by thousands of years of government. Every toll road that exists on the planet only exists because there is a government that allows it to exist. Can you see that? The government is doing so much. That is sort of the function of the government. The government sets up a almost transparent-like background infrastructure, which then allows a lot of cool things to be built on top of it. For example, there cannot be commercial jet airplane travel without government, without significant bureaucracy and regulation. Airplanes are dangerous things. They need to be highly regulated. They need to be built to specifications. As we've seen, for example, with the recent Boeing, is it 737 MAX, I believe it is, that was the poorly constructed jetliner that resulted in a couple of fatal catastrophe crashes. They had to halt the entire production of this airplane line. Why? Because it was poorly built, improperly regulated, improperly inspected. And the only reason that these planes were pulled from service was because there is, I don't know, what is it called? The Federal Aviation Association, FAA, something like that, right? That regulates all these airplanes. Like, there are such strict regulations on not just the construction of airplanes, but even the interiors of airplanes, how many seats you can have, how close the seats can be to each other, how far away the windows are, how the air conditioning works, how many computer systems are on there built for redundancies in case one of them breaks, the other one can take over. That is super regulated. Why? Because it has to be for people to feel secure flying on an airplane. Now you might say, oh, but this is such a restriction. I just want to, Leo, why am I being prohibited? Why is the big government prohibiting me from starting my own airplane company and just building whatever kind of fucking planes I want? I want to be able to build a plane with no windows and no seats or with no redundancies. I just want to build whatever I want to build. Why can't I do that? Because we've done that in the past and we've realized the horrors of it. It was so bad that we created an entire agency that is watching and regulating these airline companies like a hawk. And still, it's not good enough to ensure the kind of security we want from these airplanes. You see? And just to have a plane fly from one part of the world to another part of the world, you need to build runways, giant runways. These runways can only exist because they're supported, defended, policed by the local governments there. So that's required. But more so, even more beyond that, it's not enough just to have two runways around the world. These are different countries, different cultures, different ethnicities, different religions. They need to all coordinate together at a global scale to allow planes to travel on a daily basis from one to the other without conflict and problem. What happens if one plane flies over some other country? That country shoots it down. You would say, oh, but that's oppression. Nobody gives a fuck. They will shoot down your plane unless we have had some treaties at an international level where we agree that if you're going to use my airspace, if you're going to fly over my airspace, then you better pay me some amount of money because you're using my airspace and whatever. And these agreements were reached. These agreements can only be reached through massive bureaucracy, infrastructure, government, and regulation. This cannot happen with small government. You can't do this in some anarchist commune. You see, when you're living in some anarchist commune, you're basically a farmer. That's all you've got is you've got farming. You've got nothing else. You have no internet, no smartphones, no cars, no computers, no entertainment. You lose all this amazing stuff. So what I want you to see is that the history of human civilization is us through an evolutionary process of trial and error, carefully selecting various restrictions. Of course, we disagree upon which restrictions and laws and regulations are good, but we go through some battle and we find those restrictions which restrict the free market precisely because we don't want a free market. It restricts the free market and creates a better society in which actually we don't have less freedom, we have more freedom. How is it that we have more freedom? Because we've sacrificed certain freedoms that weren't really relevant to us or weren't really beneficial to us. We surrender those in order to attain higher freedoms, which actually we do care about. So for example, I am happy to sacrifice my freedom to rape people if that means that what I will get for it is I will get the security of knowing that my children won't be raped. I will happily give up that freedom. Now, of course, if you're a rapist, you disagree with me because you get a kick out of raping people and maybe you don't have children. So for you, see, that's not a good deal for you. You want to be able to rape with impunity. But most people would rather give up rape and slavery and genocide and racism and some of this kind of nasty stuff, would give the freedom of that up so that we can have a society where we can have like a city with technology and where people get along with each other. They have different religions, different ethnicities, different cultures, and they can all be a melting pot, get along with each other. There's not, race wars between them. There's not genocides going on, none of that stuff, because we've surrendered that. And we've gotten something better for it. Consider this. Ask yourself this question. Is there more freedom in the countryside, rural countryside, where there's just like a little village and nothing to do? Or is there more freedom in New York City? There's actually more freedom in New York City. Because in the countryside, there are so few options. Sure, in the countryside, if you're all alone, let's say you're out in the middle of the desert, all by yourself, yeah, you've got total freedom. Do whatever you want. You can take a shit, you can do whatever you want, do it. But notice you'll get bored very quickly. Why do you get bored? Because you're just sitting there by yourself. There's nothing to do. There's nobody to talk to. There's no cars. There's no planes. There's no internet. There's nothing cool. There's no food. You're going to die out there. So you would happily sacrifice being in the middle of the desert by yourself to go to a village. In the village, there's more stuff to do. There's people, there's town, there's pubs, there's farms, there's food, there's a little bit of entertainment you can find. There's maybe some internet, whatever. There's others you can marry, have children with, date, have sex with. Cool stuff, fun, right? Great. There's alcohol. Great. That's fun. Look at how much freedom you gained by giving up the desert for the village. Because the whole point of the village, we can come together, we can build something extraordinary together that we couldn't have built by ourselves. Alone in the desert, you can't really create something as cool as a pub or a music concert or a computer. But in a village, we come together, we can create something cool like a pub or a saloon. That's easy to do in a village. Most villages have one of those. We can start to brew alcohol, have fun at night after we work. But now, go to New York City, look at all the opportunity in New York City that you can do. You can visit museums, look at art, you can go to the park, you can You can fly a hot air balloon, you can fly a helicopter, you can go on the boat, you can see a Statue of Liberty, you can go on skyscrapers, and you can go to Wall Street, and you can earn money, and you can have sex, and there's hookers, and there's drugs, and there's entertainment, and there's porn, and there's like anything you want you can find in New York City. Basically, if it exists, it exists in New York City. But the cost of living in New York City is that you have to surrender freedoms. I'm sorry, you're not allowed to go in the middle of the street in Manhattan and take a shit. Sorry, you're not allowed to do that. Sorry, you're not allowed to just like walk down the street with an AK-47 and just start pulling the trigger. You could do that in the desert. Sorry, can't do that in New York City. Because it's more complex, it's more dense. There's a lot of agents going around. We need order in a giant city. In a giant city, we got what, like 5-10 million people living there? Something like that. They need much, much more regulation so that they don't step on each other's toes. We need sophisticated court systems which will adjudicate disputes between different companies, different agencies, different people. Whereas, for example, in a village, you don't need a fancy court system. In a village, you got like your local judge. You just come to him. Maybe you even know where he lives. You can knock on his door. Two neighbors have a dispute. You can just come knock on the door of the sheriff or something. The sheriff will listen to it, and then he'll just render his verdict, and then you guys will just, adjudicate it that way in the sort of simple way. You can't do that in a giant, highly complex system like a city. So this idea of the free market, this needs to be deconstructed. The free market is a myth. It has never, ever existed. Never existed. Even if you roll back the clock and you go back to ancient Rome or ancient Egypt, there was no free market. The market is always controlled and manipulated by various agents who are making up the market. Always. There's always manipulation of the market. Why? Because every agent in the market, when they are free, by definition, they are free to pursue their own selfish agenda without restriction. And so they do, because they're selfish. So in a free market, if I can manipulate something, if I can manipulate the price, if I can manipulate the supply or the demand, if I can, create a counterfeit product, I'm going to put it out there, and that's going to be part of the free market. But we don't like that. See, you don't want a market in which there's counterfeit products and scams and pump and dump schemes and all sorts of bamboozlement going on. You want a fair market, not a free market, a fair market. And the way you get a fair market was a lot of regulation. A fair market is the opposite of a free market. Here's what libertarians fundamentally misunderstand about free markets. Free markets inherently become corrupt because the people who are constituting the market are themselves corrupt. And so that corruption will spill over into the free market. If you have a market with a lot of distributed individuals, what's going to inevitably happen is that those individuals will clump together and coordinate and cooperate to create corporations, tribes, groups, syndicates, cabals, and mafias. Why do they do that? Because that allows them, first of all, they have the freedom to do it because it's a free market. Second of all, because it allows them to get an advantage in the market. Every corporation these days does this. Every corporation tries to game their part of the market to gain some sort of advantage over all the other players in the market. How do they do that? By buying up other companies, coordinating with them, price fixing, and all sorts of other shady stuff that they could do. And in fact, if there was less regulation, it doesn't happen today, but if there was less regulation, a corporation could actually hire their own military, a mercenary group, to take out another corporation. And they would gladly do so. You think that if, for example, Microsoft had the freedom to hire its own militia, that it wouldn't hire one and then go and take out Apple or Google through physical force by just like bombing their headquarters? Of course they would. Of course they would. And the reason they would is because if they didn't, even if they were assuming they were good enough and kind enough and, you know, sweet angels, that they would that they would be above such barbarity, well, if they didn't do it, another corporation would. See, out of the thousands of corporations that there's going to be at least a handful that are corrupt enough, that are willing to hire a militia if they're allowed to, and go bomb the headquarters of other corporations. And you know what? That would be a very effective strategy, because it's going to work a lot better than building your own company. You know, it's very difficult to build a company like Apple, but you know what's pretty easy? If I have enough money, I could literally just like raise an army of 10,000 people and hire some demolition experts, and we could destroy every campus that Apple has. I mean, easy. So, so you see, that's the problem with your free market. That has to be stopped. You have to stop groups of people from creating syndicates and mafias which try to abuse everybody else and bully them. And this is the history of mankind. If there's one thing you learn from the history of mankind, is that mankind is a highly social species that creates syndicates in ever larger hierarchies, which then go on to monopolize and to bully everybody else until eventually they dominate the entire field if they're allowed to. And this, by the way, is exactly how government was created in the first place. Where did government come from? You see, here's the whole absurdity of libertarianism, is that libertarianism draws a very sharp dualistic line between the private sector and the public sector, as if these two things are unrelated or inherently different. They aren't. The way that the public sector came about at all in the first place, because it didn't exist at some point. Like 100,000 years ago, it didn't exist. There were no states and governments 100,000 years ago. There were only little villages and tribes. But what happened is, like I said, these villages and tribes, they came together, they unified because it gave them a survival advantage. They kept doing that at higher and higher orders. Mafias, syndicates were built. City-states were built. City-states combined together into nation-states. Nation-states combined together into big treaties and international alliances like NATO and so on. The Axis and Allies powers in World War II, so forth. So, and then all of this occurred, and then this is how we got the state government. Various levels of state government. It came from the private sector. Initially, it was private. In essence, what happened was that it wasn't called a corporation back then, but some group of marauders came together. They created a syndicate, which is effectively a corporation without the legal paperwork. They created a syndicate. This syndicate was like a corporation, private corporation. And it started taking over more and more land, more and more territory, more and more tribes and people. And then that was a tyranny. That corporation or that syndicate turned into a tyranny, an authoritarian dictatorship. And then through thousands of years of public pleading and protests and revolutions, what happened was that our ancestors fought with these private syndicates to seize power away from them, because the power was centralized in an authoritarian pyramid-like structure. You know, all the power went to the king or to the mob boss of that syndicate. Those people were overthrown, and eventually democratic norms started to take hold, and we got the right to vote. And now it was no longer tenable for some one guy at the top to call all the shots for his lifetime. Now he had to actually take into consideration the needs of the citizens and the elites and the legislatures and so forth. This is the history, basically, of Western Europe over the last 2,000 years. Until we got to the point where we got a solid democracy going, which is what most of Europe and America is these days. Pretty solid democracy where we elect leaders, term limits, all this sorts of stuff. So see, what happened was, here's what libertarians don't understand, is that we started with a free market. We started with a true free market, but that was so horrible that over time, the free market was monopolized and dominated by a few ruthless and bloody syndicates, which then turned into dictatorships and monarchies, which later were then revolutionized and smoothened out and kind of mollified, because that too was so brutal and evil that didn't work. So we had to take power back from the top of the monopoly and distribute it back down to the people, which made life better for most people, raised their living conditions, made them less oppressed. Now the king couldn't just, willy-nilly execute somebody. He had to ask a court. There has to be a crime. It has to be proven in court, this sorts of stuff. See? So we had the free market 10,000 years ago. It was shit. And now we got something much better. We got a fair market. It's not perfect. It's not perfectly fair. There's still a lot of corruption and stuff. We need to fix it. We can work on it. It can get a lot better. But you should be very grateful that we have what we have. And the only reason we have what we have is because we have taxation. None of this stuff is possible without taxation. So when libertarians make this claim, this absurd claim that taxation is theft, and the reason they make this claim is because they say, well, the government has a monopoly of force, which isn't fair. It's not fair for government to have a monopoly of force. So why should they be able to force me to pay some amount of money that I didn't agree to pay? Yeah, sorry, buddy. You live in a community. What you don't understand, what you need to get through your thick skull, is that you are part of a fucking community. You are not an individual. Forget this myth of the individual. There never was such a thing. It's pure hogwash. This romanticized, naive notion that if we roll back the clock and we go back 1,000 years or 10,000 years or 100,000 years, that people were living as rugged individuals. Like the sort of, the John Wayne Mad Max character who's like just, he's walking through the desert, he walks into town, he's just like this individual, he's by himself, he doesn't rely on anybody, this sort of guy. You think like that's how people lived 10,000 years ago? No. 10,000 years ago, human life was far more collectivist than it is now. Far more. You had no individual rights, basically. There wasn't even such a notion of individualism. When you lived in a tribal culture, and there are still cultures like this around in many parts of the world, in third world countries, you'll find these tribal cultures. In these tribes, like in like Papua New Guinea someplace, or in the Amazon, or in Africa, in Indonesia, Middle East, still very tribal in the Middle East. You find these tribes, when you're living in a small tribe of 100 people, your life is completely wedded to that tribe. Why? Because you can't survive without it. An individual human cannot survive in the wilderness. It's impossible. Get this. Really get this. Because you have this sort of modern notion of like, well, but there are shows, Leo, what about those survival shows on the Discovery Channel or something where like one dude is living out in Alaska in the middle of nowhere by himself. He's been living there for 3 years. He seems to be doing good. He's happy. He's hunting moose and living it up there, fishing, and nobody's bothering him, and it's all nice and peaceful, and like, look, it works. No, this is a fantasy. It doesn't work. First of all, what you got to realize is that the only reason that person's able to live in that wilderness in Alaska even for a year, is because he has supplies that were manufactured by a giant government, or at least enabled by a giant government. Those people in those survival shows, they need rifles. They need bullets and ammunition that needs to be constantly resupplied. They need fishing gear. They need hooks. They need fishing line. They need matches and camp starter kits and flints and tents and whatever else, shovels and axes and knives, bottles. None of this is possible by yourself. One of the things I find most outrageous about some of these survival shows. I love to watch some of those survivor shows like, Bear Grylls or Survivor, man. You watch some of those, or like, Below Zero, the Alaska wilderness survival show. Like, they're really interesting and worthwhile to watch because it gets you a little bit of sense of, what survival really was like for our ancestors. But still, it doesn't get you a true sense of it. Because usually when they throw some like Bear Grylls guy into a wilderness, he's got a fucking knife with him. And then he's doing all this stuff with the knife. He's making himself a spear, and he's making a bow and arrow. He's making some fishing hooks from like bone, carving it with a knife. And I'm like, yeah, but where the fuck are you going to get a knife in the wilderness? That's like you might as well just, Bear Grylls might as well just walk into a jungle with an AK-47. It would be as realistic as walking into a jungle with a knife. Your ancestors didn't have knives. Well, I'm talking about like a steel fucking, high quality like Rambo knife, the kind that usually Bear Grylls will carry into the jungle. No. At best, your ancestors had like rocks and stuff. So it was even more difficult than it seems in those shows. And anyways, those people, they usually live there in the wilderness for a few years, then they come back to civilization. They don't live there for their entire lifetime. It would be virtually impossible. They need to come back every year to resupply. They need to get stuff drop shipped into them. Medical supplies. Like, I was watching some of those shows. There was some lady on one of these shows. She was like out in the wilderness, and then she was driving her snowmobile, and then the snowmobile tipped over and it fell on her and it like broke her leg or something like that. And the only reason she survived was because she was able to crawl back to her technologically advanced base, which had internet. She was able to get her like satellite phone, call like some medical center that was 500 miles away in Alaska, and get like a helicopter or a plane, bush plane to fly in and to, rescue her. Then she'd get to go to a hospital with professional doctors. The only reason that's possible is because of the giant government that's there. So you get this false sense with these survival shows, you get this false sense of individualism that you can just kind of like live out there on your own. Or some of these, doomsday prepper people who think that, I'm going to build my own bomb bunker. I'm going to stock it with supplies, canned goods and MREs and stuff. And I'm just going to like live there by myself. Then when the bombs go off, I'll just be there, and then, I'll survive it all. And then I'll come out and I'll be able to make it. My family and I, we're going to be the smart ones. We're going to be able to make it. No, you won't. If there's a true nuclear war, you're not going to be able to make it. If there's a serious collapse of civilization, you're not going to be able to make it because everything will devolve into complete barbarism. And your supplies, they'll run out. How long? Even if you have the best stockpile of supplies, it'll be a year or two at most. You'll run out of your supplies and food and water. What are you going to do? Where are you going to go get it? You're going to have to go fight for it. And other people will be fighting for it. You see? So in tribal cultures like in the Amazon, they live very communally and collectively. In a sense, it's pure communism. You don't have the freedom to say like, in a society, like you're in a tribe and you're like, fuck the tribe. I'm not going to do what you guys want me to do. I'm just going to be an individual. I don't want to, don't infringe on my personal rights. Like, you expect me to come do something for you, like go on a hunt with you or go marry that person over there or like, do whatever the tribe is going to do, fight some tribal war for you. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to be myself. They'll fucking kill you because you're a traitor to the tribe. You can't survive in those situations. If everybody in the tribe behaved like a libertarian, the tribe wouldn't exist. It would all go extinct, which is why there are no libertarians in tribes. Even just the idea of that. If you go to the Amazon or to Africa or to Indonesia, you find a tribe, you get a translator, and then you explain the libertarian ideology to those tribes people, they will fucking laugh. This will be the funniest thing they've ever heard. You tell them that there are these people who think that they can be individuals and they have individual rights and they don't have to make any sacrifices for the community. These people will laugh because you can't survive that way. The only way you can survive that way is if you're living in the luxury of a modern, gigantic, multi-million citizen nation, which allows you to have the freedom of having your own individual house on your own plot of land by yourself, somewhere maybe in the wilderness. And then you can do that while you drive to Costco or to Walmart to pick up supplies to fuel that. And you have electricity, supplied there. You have solar panels, all that stuff. And then, then you can live off the grid like that. And you're still highly dependent on the grid. See? So the irony is that libertarian ideology is only made possible by all of the things that libertarians are opposed to. See? There actually would not exist a libertarian ideology unless there was a monopoly of force and a giant bloated government and bureaucracy that allowed for it. Because you can't even have an education system without that, you see. Just to be able to be intelligent enough to do philosophy, to be able to write books, to philosophize about moral principles, this already requires an education system, universities, schools, and so on, which don't exist without taxation. See? How could there be people who would read Ayn Rand's books if there wasn't a public education system? You see how absurd the position is? This sort of Ayn Randian position of like, well, we're all individuals and taxation is wrong and collectivism is wrong. Yeah, but the only reason that today 99% of people are literate is because of public education, which is directly funded by taxation and which is a collectivist endeavor. School is a collective institution, and its function is collectivist. The reason we have schools, the reason people are made literate is because that's helpful to the entire community that we're a part of. When our community is made up of a bunch of illiterate morons who can't add 1 + 1 together or who can't read a basic book, we all suffer for that. This is fundamentally what many libertarians don't understand, because they're so bought into this philosophy of individualism that they treat individualism as an absolute good, and they treat communalism as an absolute bad, or collectivism as an absolute bad. This is so misguided. It's so dysfunctional. It's so unhealthy for you, because it makes you like a cancer within your own community. We humans are a highly social communal species. We can only survive as a community. There was never a time in human history, not even 1,000,000 years ago, where there weren't even barely humans, but there were our ape ancestors. Even back then, individual apes didn't survive, only in a community. Go look at how chimpanzees survive, only in a community. There's not a lot of individual rights and freedoms in a chimpanzee troop. There's actually order and hierarchy, precisely because it's necessary. There's certain implicit rules that need to be followed, certain laws, if you will, which make that troop function. It's a communal endeavor. So it's very important that you start to acknowledge that to yourself, that you're part of a community. And this community, it has its pros and cons. Stop looking at a community as just all the negative stuff. That's, I think, what a lot of libertarians and some conservatives who are very sort of like individualistic minded, they tend to forget how much benefit the community gives them, what it allows that couldn't otherwise be possible. And also, there's a joy to being part of a community. A community gives you a sense of a larger meaning. You could, there's something you can work towards. There's perhaps a sense of national pride, although that's problematic. That gets us into nationalism. There can be tribal pride, of course, that gets us into tribalism. But still, there's a healthy form of national pride that you can have. You can have a pride in humanity. You can have a career that you work towards, helping mankind to achieve a certain goal. We can work together towards amazing things. But only if we're willing to make certain sacrifices. And part of the challenge of being born into the 21st century, into this sort of advanced state of society relative to where it was, let's say 100,000 years ago, part of the challenge is that you weren't really given an option. You were just born into this world, and you were immediately thrown into a collective, highly collective situation. And you were forced as a child, as a little baby, you were forced to deal with it. You were forced to learn how to communicate with others, how to have respect, not be rude to others, how to have manners, how to have etiquette, how to have what we call morals, how to, enforce your own boundaries, but also not let others step over your boundaries, how to be able to play with friends and how to work with coworkers and bosses and all of this stuff. And it's very challenging. It can be very frustrating. And hey, I'm a very individualistic-minded person. I don't like to really be part of collectives so much. But look, we have no choice. We have no choice. You are part of a collective no matter what. The only question is, are you going to be conscious of how collectives work? Are you going to make smart, intelligent choices? Are you going to be okay with certain restrictions? Because we're going to be making restrictions no matter what. Restrictions and laws and regulations will get made. The only question is, what kind will they be? And will they get us a net positive or a net negative? Regulation is not an absolute good or an absolute bad. It depends what kind it is. There are certainly bad regulations and there's good regulations. And usually it's a mixed bag. Usually every law or regulation has an upside and a downside. So it's not so simple. It's like, oh, this is a great law. It's perfect. No, there's always trade-offs. We can always make more laws. We can refine our laws to make them more nuanced and better, to better fit our, situation. And our situation is always evolving. New technology, new cultural standards, and more people. And so everything is changing. Just think about this. Let's say you get your wish. Let's say you have total freedom that you want as a libertarian. What's going to happen? Or as an anarchist, what's going to happen? Well, for a while, there will be a flat hierarchy. Everyone will just be doing their own thing. Then people will start to fight with each other because they will come together, they will clash. But there's going to be nobody to adjudicate the clash because there's no higher court to appeal to, no higher authority. So people will start to make themselves their own authorities. And so as that happens, people will start to form syndicates and cabals. They will form factions that oppose each other. One faction will be Christians, one will be Jews, one will be Hindus, one will be Buddhists, one will be Muslims. One will be liberals, one will be conservatives, one will be this, one will be that, one will be this kind of corporation, one will be another kind of corporation. And then all of them will start to fight with each other and try to oppress with each other because they're all trying to get to the top to make sure that they aren't bullied by the others. And the trickiness of the situation is that even if you're moral enough not to bully others, that's not going to be good enough because there will always be others who will not be that way and they will want to bully you and bully others. And so they will just drive you into extinction. It's survival of the fittest. This is basic evolution here we're talking about. So what are you going to do? You can't stop people from organizing into syndicates and factions from an anarchic position of total freedom. See? So what the anarchist and the libertarian doesn't understand is that if you get what you want, you will then go through a cycle of hundreds or thousands of years, and then eventually you'll come back to exactly where we are today. That's where we find ourselves today, because anarchy is inherently unstable and, in a sense, unnatural. Reality is ordering itself at ever higher levels of organization. And for that, restriction and regulation is necessary. And there's no way you're going to stop it. So give up your quixotic desire for some sort of anarchic state of total freedom where we all live communally in peace with one another. No, No. Everything is constantly evolving into higher and higher orders of complexity. The solution to this problem is to start to unify those factions together and to get them to see a common good and a common goal that we can all rally around together. That doesn't mean that all of them will completely merge and lose all their individualism. They can still maintain individuality, but as a collective. And we agree to certain rules that we're all going to follow and not cheat, because that's going to benefit all of us if none of us cheat. And then we put into place some institutions and organizations that help to make sure that people aren't cheating each other, that they're staying true to their original commitments to community, because it's for the greater good of us all. So here's the paradox, is that the big government that libertarians rail against is actually the direct result of a true free market. That's what the libertarian does not understand. The free market allows for oppression and domination, and as that happens, it becomes so ugly that people realize that we don't really want a free market. What we want is a fair, regulated market. And so they create that. But it's the libertarians who don't see that they're in denial about it, because they have this myth of the free market being able to solve all of mankind's problems, being an absolute good. No, that's not true. It's just not true. Think it through. So big oppressive government actually comes from the private sector. If you don't have a big government with a military and a monopoly of force, what's going to happen is that one of the private entities or factions will become that by monopolizing the entire market and then crowning itself king. And that's how you get a state government with a monopoly of force. You might say this is a bad thing. It's actually not a bad thing, because that king will not be stable either, because it's too brutal, and it'll actually eventually get democratized, and then we'll get the right to vote, and then more democracy will come, and then eventually this what used to be this private sector, which was purely authoritarian, now becomes distributed democracy. It gets softened. It becomes less brutal, and actually it's quite nice. It works quite well. Sure, you got to pay your taxes, but hey, that's a small price to pay to make sure that your government protects you from being invaded, raped, and pillaged by a neighboring country, a neighboring militia, a neighboring tribe, or another syndicate of some sort. You see, the thing that libertarians don't understand is that by deregulating the government, the federal government in America, for example, what you're doing is you're creating a power vacuum. You're weakening the central authority, which is the referee. The function of a democratic government is to act as the referee, to create an ecosystem where all players are playing fairly and aren't oppressing and exploiting each other. When you reduce the power of the referee and his rules, which he has set for that to happen, what that allows you remove the regulations, that allows every private player to exploit without restriction and to seek to overthrow the referee. See? Every giant corporation seeks a monopoly, whether it's Microsoft, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, oil companies, and so forth. What's the only thing that's stopping them? You might say, well, it's the free market. No, it's actually not the free market. It's the government. It's the monopoly of force. It's government regulation. Because what would inevitably happen if there was no serious government regulation against monopolies and in other ways? What would happen is that one of these giant companies, like Amazon, would eventually get the bright idea to hire their own militia and to take over all the other governments, all the other companies by force, because it would be profitable to them to do so, and then eventually to undermine and take over the entire government so that they could crown themselves king. And if they ever succeeded in doing that, which maybe they could, If we weaken the federal government enough, they actually could succeed in doing that. I don't really expect that's a serious possibility, but in theory it's possible. But if that ever was to happen, notice what would happen. We would go back to the place where we had tyrants and kings. So it would be another cycle of hundreds or thousands of years before we democratized what we would now call Amazon. Amazon would eventually, through revolution and protest and so forth, would have to become democratized, and it would just become exactly what we have today. You see, the problem with a corporation is that it's inherently authoritarian. The guy who owns it, the people who own the stocks, they call all the shots. Everybody else is just their slave or their employee in a sense. Sure, you could leave the corporation, go to a different corporation, but the nice thing about a democratic government is that you get a vote. Everybody gets a vote, theoretically. I mean, it's not perfect. We have problems with voting. They're not perfect by any means. We have gerrymandering and so forth. We can make voting more fair, but still, it's way better. Like, you don't have any say as to the direction of Amazon and what Amazon does. But you do have some say as to what the American government does, more so than Amazon. That's why the American government is actually less oppressive and less problematic than something like Amazon. The only reason Amazon isn't so bad, perhaps in your mind, is simply because they haven't really gotten to the size of the American government. Remember, American government is a massive thing. So basically what we need, if we want a good society, a fair, peaceful society, we need some sort of benevolent, overarching force, which is serving as a neutral referee for all the independent agents, making sure that they play nice. It's sort of like the parents watching over their kids in the sandbox. Yes, the parents set limitations on what the kids can do. You can't just, hit another kid with a pail full of sand in the face. Can't do that. Sorry. Yeah, it restricts your freedom. But you know what else it buys you? It buys you the ability to have a nice time with friends in the sandbox. Build sandcastles without having some asshole come and destroy it. That's literally it. That's what we're talking about. Because the military fundamentally cannot be privatized, because if it were, that would be a dictatorship, basically, in effect, or a tyranny. The federal government is non-negotiable. So either you're going to have a strong federal government, which is democratic, or you're going to have essentially a private government, which is going to be ownership of the military, a military dictatorship. You're going to have one or the other. And the military, in case you haven't understood, is socialism and collectivism. This is what's so funny about conservatives and right-wingers who think that socialism is some absolute wrong or evil. Dude, the history of mankind is a history of community and socialization. We come together and we work together to protect ourselves and to do better for ourselves, to build a better future and community for ourselves. That is the essence, basically, of socialism. In a sense, every society is socialistic, and the military is highly, highly socialized. Although, actually, right now, there's a problem. The American government is actually starting to privatize the military, as if that's a good idea. See, the more you privatize the military, the more corporations are playing a role in the military, the more the corporations' financial interests are what is guiding the direction of the entire U.S. foreign military policy. That leads us into terrible wars and all sorts of other things. So stop demonizing collectivism. Also stop strawmanning collectivism. It might sound like I'm sitting here and arguing for some super communist state of super collectivism, some sort of hive mind Borg collective. No, I'm not arguing for that at all. I'm saying that what we have right now, America right now, is collectivist already. America 100 years ago, whenever you thought America was great, it was, 1950s or the 1900s or the 1800s. Whenever you thought America was great, it was already highly collectivist then. You just don't realize. You don't want to admit it because you made some boogeyman out of collectivism. Libertarians tend to think that private police, private fire departments, private roads, private courts, private education, private prisons, not only would they work, but they would be preferable to public versions of this. This is absurd. Absurd, absurd, absurd. If you go to third world countries, what you see is actually you see the effects of sort of privatization in these various areas, like the police or education or prisons or courts. This is actually known as corruption. See, what libertarians fundamentally misunderstand is the nature of what corruption is. Libertarians tend to think that big government is more corrupt than little government. This is actually the opposite of the case. If you study the literature, if you study how governments grow, develop, and evolve, what you realize that the smaller the government, local government has more corruption, not less, because it's less accountable. Because it's smaller, it's easier to corrupt. It's much easier to corrupt one sheriff or one judge in a small 1,000-person town in the middle of nowhere. It's much harder to corrupt some judge or sheriff in a giant city like New York City, because they have internal affairs departments, they have regulators looking over them, they have other judges, other police people. It wouldn't even be that advantageous to bribe or corrupt a single judge or a single sheriff in New York City, because you wouldn't even know whether that judge or that sheriff would be even looking over your case. Whereas in a small town, there's probably only one judge, one sheriff. You know exactly who you need to bribe. In countries that are less developed, like India, Russia, Brazil, China, the Philippines, elsewhere, corruption is rampant. The reason it's rampant is because the very nature of humans, when they're tribal, the closer you get, the more you roll back the clock, the closer you get to our original tribal roots. In tribes, corruption is just the norm. What corruption basically is it's cronyism and it's favoritism. So for example, if I'm the chief of my tribe and you come to me and you want something from me, we can make a deal together. You can offer me something, I can offer you something, I can make you a deal you don't want to refuse, that sort of stuff. This kind of mafia stuff. Where did the mafia come from? It comes from Italy, rural parts of Italy, which were basically kind of tribalistic. They weren't very developed, there wasn't much regulation, and everybody was sort of creating their little family. So it's my family. That's literally what corruption is when you treat some small segment of the population as your family and everybody else as external, so you can exploit the external ones for the benefit of the internal ones. That's fundamentally what corruption is. It's favoritism. It's playing favorites. It's a lack of neutrality. It's selfish bias, survival. And in places where regulation is lacking, like in Russia, India, China, Brazil, elsewhere, corruption is rampant. And it's horrible. It's horrible. In Russia, for example, police will just stop you on the street. And the only reason they stop you is because they're expecting a bribe. You just bribe them with cash and they keep driving. This is standard practice in Russia. At least when I was there, some 10 or 15 years ago, last time I was there. Standard practice. I'm pretty sure it's still that way today, and it's that way in most countries. In most third world countries, you can't start a business unless you bribe some official. Impossible to maintain your business. You might say, oh, but Leo, all these problems only get worse with bigger government. No, that's where you're wrong. They get better with bigger government because there's more regulation, more oversight, more transparency. More infrastructure and bureaucracy gets created. You fucking libertarians. With your bureaucracy, you've got this attitude of anti-bureaucracy. You think bureaucracy is a bad thing. Bureaucracy is not a bad thing. You need to study what a bureaucracy is and why it exists. Bureaucracy was invented to eliminate corruption. The reason it's so rigid, the reason when you go into the DMV and there's a certain protocol that you have to follow, you have to stand in line, wait for a ticket, the clerk has to help you, they have to do things in this sort of very rigid way, is because that's how you eliminate corruption. If it was just willy-nilly, if you could just kind of go to the DMV, maybe slip the guy $50 to put you forward in line, and then you pay him, you slip him another $100 to get you the kind of driver's license you want, put the kind of age you want on it, and so forth. That happens in most other countries around the world. It's horribly inefficient, and it harms the entire community. It's like an internal friction. If we think of a society or a community as a fluid, in physics, fluids. Fluids have a property called viscosity, different kinds of viscosity. High viscosity means it's very thick fluid, like honey or oil, and then low viscosity is like water. It's very thin. So the ideal community would have low viscosity, where everything is functioning smoothly without a lot of energy lost to friction. But in a small, when the government is small, there's more corruption, and that corruption eats up a lot of resources. Because everybody's cheating everybody else, basically, with this corruption. Everybody's playing favorites, trying to get for themselves. In doing that, by being so selfish, we end up hurting everybody collectively. But to solve that, we need more regulation, not less. We need bigger government, not smaller. Another thing that libertarians fundamentally misunderstand is the function of the ego mind and selfishness. The libertarian takes selfishness totally for granted. The libertarian does not understand how selfish humans are, how blind they are to their own selfishness, and how exploitative the human mind will be. The human mind will exploit any system in the free market, without any moral qualms. If a system can be exploited, it will be exploited. So for you libertarians, the challenge for you is to think through your policies and the system you want to construct, and to don't ask, how would a decent person operate in this system? Ask, how would the most narcissistic, bloodthirsty, ruthless, sociopathic, psychopathic, selfish person, egotistical person, how would that person operate in this system? How would he exploit your system? That's the real problem. If you don't create a system which keeps those people in check, they will monopolize the entire system and they will become tyrants. Do not assume that just because you're good, just because you're living up to your libertarian moral standards, and that you treat people nicely and that you would never do such a thing, that there aren't egos in the world who would. There are millions of them who would. Libertarians fundamentally misunderstand relativity. I have a whole episode called Relativity, Understanding Relativity, Part 1. I'm going to release a Part 2 as well in the future. Relativity just basically means that everything, in a sense, is relative to something else. There's no absolute good or bad. Good and bad is relative to your identity and your survival agenda. Go check out my episodes called Understanding Survival Part 1, Part 2, which explain this, the relativity of survival in enormous detail. Very important. You will transform your whole life by watching those 2 episodes, if you're a libertarian. Yeah, so I hate to break it to you, but there's no such thing as good and bad. They don't exist. This is all an invention of your own mind. They've never existed. Good and bad are simply what your ego thinks is good and bad for its survival. Good and bad is socially and mentally constructed. Natural law does not exist. Natural rights do not exist. Property rights do not exist. These are all human inventions. They all had to be invented, and they all had to be codified into an infrastructure, part of which is culture, which is why you have these in the first place. The reason you as a libertarian think that there are such things as natural laws and natural rights and property rights and good and bad and morality and all this, the reason you think that is simply because this was programmed to you by the infrastructure, the software of your community. That's why you think that. And because of that, you think it's objective. You think it existed all the time, or that it exists somewhere outside of the human mind. It doesn't. And what's worse is that every community has their own set of natural laws and natural rights and property rights and good and bad, what they consider those things. Now, of course, you could make the case that, well, Leo, every society on the planet believes that murder is wrong or that rape is wrong. Actually, that's not true. The more true statement is that every society on the planet commits murder in different ways. And then they just rationalize it and justify it as whether it's okay or not okay in different ways. See? This is all highly relative. Is giving a criminal the death penalty, like is giving a drug addict, or not a drug addict, but is giving a drug trafficker the death penalty as they do in China, is that good or is that bad? Is that morally right or wrong? Is that fair or unfair? Whatever idea you have of it, it's completely relative. There's no way that it actually is. It is how you think it is. And unless you think that it is that way, it isn't any way at all. That's what relativity means. You know, it's funny to me. Of course, if you're a strong libertarian, you're going to deny this. But just consider the following point. In science, in the most hard core of scientific disciplines, in physics, science has long ago proven and accepted as consensus that physical space and time itself are relative. This was demonstrated by people like Leibniz in terms of the relativity of space, and Albert Einstein in terms of the relativity of time. Despite this, most people still, our culture by and large doesn't appreciate the significance of the relativity of these two things, space and time. So think about this. Physical space and time are fucking relative. And yet you somehow think that your human idea of good and bad and moral and immoral, that this is not relative but absolute? Come on. Get real. You're so full of shit. Really appreciate what Einstein discovered. Time. Physical time. The fucking clock that is sitting on your wall or on your wrist is relative. Yeah. So your entire moral system is completely arbitrary and relative. And it's worse than arbitrary. It's completely selfish. It's completely corrupted and self-biased by your selfish agenda. And the only way we fix that is through better infrastructure. The next thing that libertarians really get wrong is they fundamentally misunderstand the complexity and scale of reality and community of community. They take complexity and scale for granted. Many of these libertarians or anarchists, they will reason about their political ideas and policies using this very kind of simplistic notion of like, well, there's two farmers living out in the woods, and then like one farmer comes to the other farmer, steals his land, and like this very simple, low scale. It's a scale we're talking about, 100 people, at a scale of 100 people. There's a lot of stuff that works at a scale of 100 people or 1,000 people that does not work at a scale of 1 million or 1 billion or 8 billion people. And the complexity that exists in these simplistic examples of like, oh, well, yeah, some farmer is building a road and then his neighbor comes by and they get into an argument and they settle the argument, blah, 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 blah. This is not the complexity of society in the 21st century. We're talking about gigantic bureaucracies, organizations within organizations within organizations. We're talking about thousands, millions of regulations. We're talking about multiple levels of policing and enforcement and regulation. And you might say, well, this is all bad stuff. No, it's not bad stuff. This is absolutely critical. The reason this much layer is necessary is because it's complex. Reality is complex. Our society is so complex. In a little village, you don't have a lot of complexity. There aren't cars and motorcycles and airplanes and, prisons and internet providers. There aren't all this complex stuff. The more our society grows, the more complex our community becomes, the more complex our government needs to be to properly regulate it. It's actually similar to writing software code. A complex operating system has many, many layers within it of regulation. You can't just have some software app that you load onto a Mac or onto a Windows machine, and this app just has total freedom to do whatever the fuck it wants. It doesn't have access to just all parts of RAM and all parts of the CPU and all the BIOS and all that stuff. No, it's highly, highly restricted because the potential for abuse is enormous. If you give that kind of power or freedom is a better word, that kind of freedom to an app, which is why Microsoft patches Windows like every single week. They're patching Windows. They're just patching and patching. This is the bane of every software company in the world, is they keep patching shit nonstop. They have to keep patching shit. Why do they issue all these patches? Because they're constantly being exploited by hackers. The function of a good operating system is precisely that it sets rules and regulations for what your apps can do. This restricts the freedom of the app, but also it creates for a more stable ecosystem. When you allow any app to do whatever it wants in an operating system, the operating system gives you the blue screen of death every day, which used to happen a lot in something like Windows 95, if you remember those days. And then Microsoft made their systems more complex. They started to separate various layers of the BIOS and the software kernel, OS kernel and all this. They started to separate, compartmentalize everything, draw borders around every app, restrict what any app can possibly do, such that now Windows is pretty damn stable. I can run Windows for like a month and not experience a crash. Why? Because of all these restrictions that Microsoft has thankfully put in place. I don't want to be working on Windows 95, even though Windows 95 was probably a lot freer. You could write like any kind of virus you wanted for Windows 95, hijack the entire system. You see, as software gets more complicated, as hackers get more complicated, Microsoft has to get more complicated with its code. In a sense, government has to get more complicated. Microsoft is just a substitute for government here. They have to get more complicated with their regulations, become more restrictive. But don't try to think of this as some authoritarian scheme. It's not. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be a tyranny. Don't strawman this. Libertarians lack systemic thinking. Go check out my episode called Systems Thinking, where it's called An Intro to Systems Thinking, to be exact, which goes into a lot of depth on systems thinking, which I can't explain here. But fundamentally, because the libertarian is just thinking from his own selfish point of view, and kind of what's good for him and what he thinks is right, his own personal philosophy. He's not thinking about like how different people have different philosophies, different worldviews. Not everyone is libertarian. Not everyone has the same moral system. There's complex systems that work within society. They're there for a reason. A lot of times they work in counterintuitive ways where you think you're gonna make something better, but it ends up backfiring, makes something worse. One of the secrets to, or one of the principles of systems thinking is that before you start to change a system, you have to go observe the system and study the counterintuitive ways in which it works, which is exactly what a libertarian does not do. For example, a libertarian is not going to go study a system like Social Security or some healthcare system of the government to really think about how that system works and what benefits it provides, what limitations it has, and so forth, what the trade-offs are, how to maybe improve the system. Libertarian doesn't care about this. Libertarian just has this dumb ideological position of like, well, more complexity, more government bad, more regulation bad, less regulation good, small government good. Like this is grossly inadequate to deal with the complexities of a modern civilization. Bureaucracy is absolutely necessary at mass scale. Scale is the crucial thing here. The dynamics completely change. What works in a tribe of 1,000 people is not going to work in New York City. You need completely new solutions. So your simplistic libertarian and anarchistic examples, they just don't fly. It might work in the countryside with 100 people, but it ain't going to work in the cities and societies we live in today. Libertarians also don't understand holons. I'll have a video on holons in the future, but what holons mean is that all of reality is made out of holons. A holon is a whole and a part simultaneously. Everything in reality is both a whole and a part. So for example, you could say my body is a whole. You could say it's a human called Leo. Okay, here it is. It's a holon. It's made out of parts. Parts like organs, heart, kidneys, liver, etc. So I have organs. Each of those organs has subparts. You know, the heart, the liver has its own individual parts. Each of those parts has its own parts, which are individual cells. Each cell has individual parts, which are organelles. All of those organelles are made up of smaller parts called proteins. Those are made up of amino acids. Those are made up of smaller parts called, what are amino acids made of? Like carbon and nitrogen, that kind of stuff. Basically atoms or molecules of stuff, organic molecules. Those are made out of atoms. Then atoms are made out of subatomic particles, protons, electrons, quarks, and down and down it goes. And up it goes. You know, Leo is part of something bigger, part of the planet, part of the community, part of blah, 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 part of the universe. These are all holons. But you might say that's obvious, but what's not so obvious is that there's a trade-off. Every holon in the universe is very delicately balancing the trade-off between its own individuality or autonomy, as they call it, and community. So, you see, the cells that make up my face right now, on the one hand, they have a certain amount of autonomy. They're able to do their own thing. Every cell in my face has its own individual ability to open ion channels, allow certain chemicals and materials to come in, certain to come out. It can, replicate, it can heal itself, repair itself, and so forth. Every cell has that in the entire body, trillions of these cells. That's pretty amazing. But at the same time, every cell is part of a larger whole and working towards a larger goal beyond itself. So if a cell just willy-nilly decides to like, hey, I'm going to do whatever the fuck I want. I'm not going to be a part of this collective community called Leo. I'll just do whatever the fuck I want. I know, you know what I want? I just want to reproduce. I don't give a fuck about these other cells. I'm just going to multiply as much as I want. You know what that's called? Cancer. That's cancer. In order for some larger order thing to emerge, which is called a human being sitting here speaking to you, every cell in this body of 1 trillion cells has to coordinate with each other. I mean, this is staggering. It's staggering when you think about this. The scope of reality is fucking staggering, and this is just a single human being in a giant universe of trillions of other beings. It's staggering what my body is doing right now just to deliver these words to you. You should be having chills running up your spine right now as you're realizing what I'm telling you, because it's so profound. Every cell is coordinated and playing part. It's giving up its individual freedoms to be part of a larger community, which is the organs that are making up my body, which then also give up their own individual autonomy. My heart can't just do whatever the fuck it wants. It can't beat at the certain rate that it might want to. It has to beat at the rate it needs to in order for my mouth to move. My mouth muscles need to coordinate with my brain, need to coordinate with my hands, all of this, my eyes, all of it needs to coordinate together to be able to produce something like this conversation that we're having right now. And the only way that's possible is because there is an exquisite balance between autonomy and community happening at the entire scale of reality, at every level of holon. Get that? This is so fundamental. And yet, this is exactly what libertarians don't understand. Because libertarians, they create this false choice as though autonomy is good and community is bad. And surrendering any kind of autonomy for the sake of some higher good, that this is somehow terrible. It's not terrible. This is what creates your body. Literally, you are made out of the thing which is contradicting your entire libertarian worldview. The thing you think is an individual is actually a community of 1 trillion cells working together, selflessly sacrificing so that you can be there spouting your bullshit libertarian ideology. That's how fucking delusional you are, how ignorant you are of what's really going on. You're like a tiny speck within a giant ocean, and you think that you are the whole ocean. No, you're a tiny little speck. Community requires sacrifice. Reality is constantly, evolution is constantly pushing reality to create more complex life forms, more complex communities and social institutions. And there's no end to this. It's going to keep happening. So get rid of this fantasy that we're going to, at some point in 1,000 years, humans are going to be living as the, in some bucolic, pastoral setting in the grass somewhere on a farm. This is not going to happen. In 1,000 years, humans will probably all be interconnected into some Borg hive mind fucking collective. You will just be able to, you're born, you're instantly plugged into the fucking matrix. In that matrix, you have unlimited fucking power. You can just basically be in a virtual world of your own creation. You can create whatever virtual world you want. You can have a family, you can have sex, you can do whatever you want, and it'll be as good or better than physical reality. That's probably what we're heading to in the very long term. We're heading to ridiculously uncomfortable levels of collectivism. Now, we don't have to really worry about that too much in practice because we're going to be dead by then, so it's not going to be a problem. But society is constantly battling itself over higher and higher orders of collectivism. Like if you just rewind the clock 200 years, go back to the Revolutionary War, before the United States was a federal single union, every colony, the 13 original colonies, it was just a federation of colonies. Every colony wanted to maintain its autonomy. You can actually go back and read the writings of our founding fathers. Many of them argued that we shouldn't even have a United States. They argued that the whole point was to have the autonomy of the individual colonies, and that was the right way. Basically, they were taking the libertarian position. And but then other of our founding fathers, they had more vision, and they were able to see that, no, we will be stronger because we have enemies. We have France, we have Germany, we have Russia, enemies from around, who can dominate us. We're going to be better off if we unite as a United States. And so they pushed for it. There was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of, teeth pulling. Basically, a lot of teeth had to be pulled to get this to happen because, again, the reasoning was very much the libertarian one. The people who were against the United States, who wanted just the colonies, they basically argued that they don't want to be taxed. It was a sort of an anti-taxation argument. And they don't want to give up their individual sovereignty as colonies to some tyrannical government. But of course, now, 200 years later, it's obvious to us that the United States is much stronger and better as a union than it is as an individual 50 countries or colonies. See, the advantage of a union is that it works more smoothly on the insides. You don't have to fight yourself. If every state in the union, all 50 of them, was its own country, it would have to have its own military, its own bigger, they already do have their own governments, but their governments would have to be bigger because they'd have to manage military, they'd have to manage all sorts of internal affairs stuff, and there'd be a lot more overhead there. It would be highly inefficient, and on top of all that, these states would all fight with each other. What prevents California from nuking New York City? Have you thought about that? Think about that. You've probably never thought about that in your entire life, have you? I would submit to you that the only thing that prevents that is the fact that we're a union. And we have a larger organization that coordinates these things, creates a unified sense of identity between us such that we don't even recognize a need to want to bomb a neighboring city because we see that city as being part of who we are. But when it comes to Russia, no, they're something else. We can nuke them. Or when it comes to North Korea, we can nuke them because they're not part of us. They're not part of our collective. So a lot of energy is wasted by fighting between small parts, which is why unification happened in the first place with human cities and towns and so forth. They became more efficient and more powerful, less wasteful of energy when they weren't constantly fighting with each other. Can you imagine if every city in the United States had its own militia the way that cities had 2,000-3,000 years ago during the Roman times? Every city had a perimeter wall built around it with its own militia. Can you imagine how inefficient this would be? How restrictive this would be? You couldn't just get in a car and travel across the country, do a nice road trip, stay in a motel, go to New York, go to Boston, go to Canada, drive up there. You couldn't do this. This freedom is only afforded by the fact that we were united under one power which has a monopoly of force. A monopoly of force is absolutely necessary because the whole point, the reason that a community can have peaceful cooperation is because we come together in a community and then we say, okay, obviously I can't be my own policeman because I'm selfish. I could be corrupt. If everybody was their own policeman in a small community, everyone would have a gun, everybody would shoot everybody else as soon as they felt that they were wronged. But the problem is that people are selfish and biased, so you can't trust people to carry out their own justice. So when we come together into, because it's too violent. I mean, you can do it. There are communities like that, but it turns into gangs of New York. So to make that work, we come together and we say, okay, I'm going to give up my gun. You're going to give up your gun. I'm going to give up my right to kill your children. You're going to give up your right to kill my children. I'm going to give up my right to steal from you. You're going to give up your right to steal from me. And we're going to live peacefully together, and we're going to trade and do nice things that we all agree are decent and fine. But if any one of us cheats or violates that, then we all agree that we're going to go to this person here who is the judge or the king, whatever. He's going to look at our case. He's going to be neutral and unbiased. He's not going to be corrupted by any one of us. He's going to be incorruptible. He's not going to take bribes from us. He's going to be an independent power. He's going to look over us, and he will determine who is in the right, who is in the wrong, who violated the rules that we all agreed to and wrote down on this giant piece of paper, the Constitution or whatever. He's going to look at that, check it, and then he's going to issue a verdict. And he's going to say, I was right and you're wrong. And then if you're wrong, you have to pay me restitution. And if you refuse, he has police he will send to take it from you. Or his bank will seize money from your bank and so forth. Put a lien on your property, sell your property to pay for my needs, whatever. This is how peace is created. When you don't have this kind of court system in place with a monopoly of force, that means that force is divided. If there are two different judges we can go to, if I can go to this judge or that judge, this one's more favorable to me. I can bribe him. You could bribe that one. Then this one has its own army. That one has its own army. Now we're going to have a war, you see. So there has to be one authority. Because if there's two authorities, those two authorities will clash with each other. Now, of course, can the judge get corrupted? Of course he can. But that's still far preferable to having individuals carry out their justice themselves. And you know what happens in society or a community where justice is not fairly carried out in a neutral, impartial manner? What happens is that people take justice into their own hands. So, for example, if we're living in a community where there is not an impartial authority, arbiter, who can issue fair judgments and also enforce those judgments. It's not enough just to issue them. He has to enforce them. There has to be teeth. Because if you've wronged me and the judge issues that verdict that now you have to pay me restitution, but he has no teeth to enforce it, that means I will not feel like I've been compensated and I will feel outraged, rightly so. Because maybe you stole something from me, maybe you killed a relative of mine, I need compensation for that. And if that guy cannot enforce the compensation that I feel I am owed, and that most of us agree is, the rules that we agree to live by, I am going to say, fuck this community, fuck this society. I'm taking this into my own hands. I'm going to go get a knife. I'm going to go to his house. I'm going to slit the throat of his children. That's how this is settled. I'm not funny. I'm not kidding. This is how it is settled in more primitive governments. There are many places around the world where this is how it's settled. These are places which don't have quality court systems. Or maybe no court systems at all. And you can't have a court system without a monopoly of force. And you can't have a court system without regulations, without bureaucracy, and big government, what you call big government. By the way, small government versus big government, this is another thing that's completely relative. This is something conservatives don't understand. Totally relative. What is small government? I mean, there's really no such thing. You might call the United States right now a big government, but I guarantee you in 1,000 years, what we have today will look like tiny government. And you might say that, well, the America that existed 300 years ago, right around the revolution, that was small government. Those were the good old days where small government was the thing. No, but the people who lived in that time, they thought that was too big of a government. There were people alive that time who were complaining about the government being too big back then. There were people who were alive 1,000 years ago complaining that even their little city-state was too big of a government. They wanted more freedom. There's always people who bitch and moan about wanting more freedom. Of course there are. It's tempting to want to bitch and moan because it's very easy to overlook what the relinquishing of that freedom really bought you. So corruption actually is not a function of size. Corruption is a function of the level of consciousness and selfishness and fear of the individual members who make up the society. The less developed people are, the less infrastructure there is, the more corruption there will be. Libertarians also fundamentally misunderstand the notion of responsibility. And this is one of the core pillars of their whole philosophy. In fact, I want to quote here one of the early libertarians, Nathaniel Brandon, who otherwise I actually respect. He wrote some great books and he did some great work on self-esteem. He wrote the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem book you might have heard me talk about a while back. Great book. But he was a libertarian, which is a problem. He was also a husband. He was married to Ayn Rand, actually. So that's where he picked up his libertarian mind virus. But here's what he says about libertarianism. He says, quote, "The libertarian mentality is a non-entitlement mentality. The libertarian mentality presupposes a person's willingness to accept responsibility for his or her own existence." End quote. I watched a talk of Nathaniel Brandon where he gave this quote, and he was talking about how the whole problem with people today is that they don't take responsibility enough, individual responsibility. And that's where libertarianism comes in. But this is to completely misunderstand human psychology. The ego mind fundamentally wants to avoid responsibility. People are not responsible. That's the whole problem. If people were responsible, if people were angels, if people were moral as you expect them to be, then we wouldn't need laws. We wouldn't need courts. We wouldn't need police. We wouldn't need military. We wouldn't need to have this talk. But that's fantasy. People are exactly the opposite of that. People are utterly fucking selfish. And what's worse is that they are completely in denial and blind to their own selfishness. They think that what they are doing isn't selfish, but that it's good, it's righteous, and it's moral. And they think that what everybody else is doing is wrong and evil and irresponsible. Responsibility requires development and consciousness, which most people don't have. social solutions, policy prescriptions need to be written and conceived in such a way as they take into account people who are not very intelligent and not very responsible and not very forward thinking, because that's how the masses of people are. They're sheep. You can't create laws in a society that assumes the best of people, because there's not enough of them relative to the general population. The general population is not educated, didn't go to college. Many of them barely finished high school. They're ignorant. There's a lot of stuff they don't understand, and they're incapable of taking responsibility for themselves. The whole point of government is to safeguard for those who are unable to take the responsibility that someone who's more responsible is able to take. So I'm going to give you two concrete examples here to drive this whole point about responsibility. The first is Social Security. In the United States, Social Security was passed some 60 years ago or 70 years ago after the Great Depression. Why did they pass Social Security? Because at that point, the population was aging, and because of the Depression and so forth, people didn't save up enough money. So basically, something like a quarter or even half of the elderly population of America were poor, living on the streets, just begging for food and scraps because they didn't save up for retirement. Now, the libertarian will come in here and say, aha, that's because they have failed at taking personal responsibility. If they took more personal responsibility, we would not need to create some social program to give them Social Security. Everybody can just invest by themselves. Leo, you can have a 401k, invest in it for 40 years, and then you'll have a nice, cushy retirement. That is the proper free market solution to the problem. What kind of fucking fantasy world are you living in? Where you are going to entrust people to save, to put money for 40 fucking years into an account, and then to manage that account so that it's not lost, it's not cheated out by Wall Street wolves, it's not cheated from them, not scammed, whatever. You're gonna trust the average person to invest for 40 years, to think 40 years down the road, to make the connection between what they're doing now and how they're gonna feel when they're 65 or 70 years old and they're not going to be able to work anymore. You expect some kid who's 30 years old, full of energy, full of vibrant health and all this, eager to have sex and drugs and all this. You expect that kid to be able to start putting money away for retirement? I mean, you're an idiot if that's what you expect. It's not going to happen. This is the perfect situation in which somebody who's more responsible and more forward-looking, looking 40 years down the road is very fucking hard. It's very hard to discipline yourself like that. Very few humans can do that. Which is why it's nice to have some really smart people in government who will think this shit up for you, create systems that make it easy and automatic. We just deduct it from your paycheck every month. You don't need to think about it too much. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to worry about it, blah, 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 blah. It'll just accumulate. Then it'll pay off. You'll get the benefits once you retire. And in this way, a lot of, millions, literally tens of millions of elderly people were saved from premature death, health problems, running out of money, and littering our streets as homeless people. Now, see, here's where the communal aspect becomes so important. If you're a libertarian and all you care about is your own individual responsibility, you might say, well, so what? Yeah, so Leo, let's just let all those people screw themselves. Why should I, as the responsible one, have to pay taxes to fund their mistakes and their ignorance? That's a fair point, but consider this. You're not living alone, you're living in a community. So consider the consequences of your proposal here. You say we're going to get rid of Social Security because you don't like the fact that you have to pay money into it every month. You feel that it's oppressive. You feel that the government is forcing it from you. Okay, but then in 40 or 60 years, you are going to be living in a society where half the elderly population is sick, crippled, disabled, and living on the streets in your neighborhood. How are you going to feel about that? You think homeless problems are a problem now? You think panhandling is a problem now? Wait till you get a load of what happens when you get rid of Social Security. See, you yourself will not want to live in that world. You have to be realistic about what people are able to do as individuals. Most people are highly irresponsible. It takes a lot of sophistication, education, development, and grooming to grow into a responsible adult. Just like kids in the sandbox. It's absurd for parents to just let kids play in the sandbox unattended, to do whatever they want, and just to say, oh, well, you know, the kids, they should be responsible for themselves. And you know what? If a kid gets his skull smashed in by a rock, some other kid, throws at him, he wasn't taking enough personal responsibility. That's his problem. See, this is utter selfishness. It's an utter lack of compassion. It's a utter lack of acknowledgement that you're part of a community. You're not living by yourself. The libertarian, whenever he's pushed into a corner, I've noticed this in their debates, whenever they get pushed into a corner, they always sort of say, well, in the end, you just take personal responsibility and you just sort of, you deal with the consequences of your poor decisions. It's always like their fallback strategy. Because a lot of times they want to eliminate all these policies and proposals and programs that are there to safeguard people. And they take on this attitude of arrogance where they think that they themselves are invincible. They think that it's like, well, yeah, it's okay if we don't have a healthcare system, a national healthcare system, because, I got good health. And those people who get sick, they're the people who, smoke cigarettes and drink alcohol and do drugs and eat too much. That's why they're sick. So that's their problem. That's not my problem. Yeah, until you get cancer. Until you have a child who's born with a genetic birth defect and you can't afford to pay for his medication because the job you're working at doesn't pay you enough to pay these exorbitant prices that some of these drug companies are gouging us for in order to, make a killing. Because, by the way, the entire healthcare system in America is a syndicate. You understand this? Speaking of mafias, we have a healthcare mafia in this country. And you libertarians are responsible for perpetuating it. Of course, this is not a responsibility that you are willing to take. So the irony of libertarians is that even though they preach personal responsibility, they are utterly, collectively irresponsible. There's not one type of responsibility. There's two fundamental types: personal responsibility and collective responsibility. The libertarian shirks collective responsibility, tries to pretend as though it doesn't exist. See, it's foolish to expect people to have enough foresight to save up a bunch of money in the case that they have a child and that child is born with a genetic birth defect that requires them to pay thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to correct. It's completely collectively irresponsible to expect that of individuals. We need a system that will make that easy to deal with by having compassion and empathy for each other, understanding that, hey, you know what? Just because I'm in a good position right now today, just because I have millions of dollars, just because I have healthy, I'm healthy and my children and family are healthy, just because that's the case today doesn't mean that tomorrow something terrible won't happen. I might lose my job. I might lose my health. I might discover some rare cancer that I have. I might, my children might get run over by a car, whatever happens, but then I might need help with that. The whole point of a community is that it safeguards us against calamitous, life-destroying accidents and tragedies that are common in nature. If you were living in the jungle, a bear might just, come out of the wilderness and maul you, nearly kill you. In which case, it's very handy to have some tribesmen, your own family or something, that can come grab you, drag you back, heal you up, bring you back to life, get you back on your feet, feed you food for months and so forth, rehabilitate you. Then you can rejoin them. You can repay them by, participating in society, and then you can help them when they get mauled by a bear or something. That's one of the functions. But when you say like, oh, that guy got mauled by a bear, then you're like, oh, well, but individual responsibility, man. You got mauled by a bear. Well, why were you walking next to the bear's cave? You shouldn't have done that. That's your problem. Now you deal with it. This is the selfishness of the libertarian philosophy. It's utterly irresponsible. And to really drive this point home, let's, of course, talk about the elephant in the room right now, which is COVID-19. If anything has demonstrated the complete untenability of libertarian philosophy, it's COVID-19, especially in America, and America's response. A lot of America's current response with the Trump administration is directly coming from a sort of libertarian philosophy. This sort of like laissez-faire, like, oh, well, the virus is out there. We'll just let the states deal with it. The local governments can deal with it. We're not going to do much testing. We're not going to ask for masks. We're not going to pass any serious legislation. We're not going to really push too hard for anything. We're going to let private companies just make a vaccine whenever they want on their time. Like, it's kind of this kind of like it's everyone's individual responsibility. It's your responsibility to wear a mask. You can wear one if you want to. If you don't want to, don't wear one. That's on you. You'll suffer the consequences. This attitude. We can clearly see now the flaws of this attitude, especially with a virus. Because we live in a fucking community. We're not individuals. We're interconnected. When I get sick, you get sick. When you get sick, I get sick. If I am not wearing a mask because I don't give a fuck, maybe I won't get sick, but I will cause you to get sick because I have no symptoms. I don't even know it. I don't get tested, but I cause you to get sick. Because the point of wearing a mask is not for me, but more for you. The point of you wearing a mask is not for you, but for me. See, so we're reciprocating. That's how community works. But people who are stuck on libertarianism, they don't understand the function, how reciprocity works. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And so we see the clear results of that. And we see in nations which have a coordinated effort against COVID, like in China, like in Europe, like in New Zealand and other places. Of course, New Zealand was very small, so it's easier for them. But, China, of course, China is very authoritarian, but still, it shows you the power and effectiveness of a coordinated response. If China had a libertarian philosophy, I don't know how many millions more would die in China than they have. I mean, not that many have died in China, but I mean, if they had a libertarian philosophy running the Chinese government, I'm telling you, millions of Chinese would be dead. Maybe tens of millions. So just think that through. Also, I hear some of you libertarians will say, oh, well, Leo, but there's that classic quote by Ben Franklin or whoever who says something like that along the lines of like, he who would sacrifice individual freedom for security will end up with neither, or something like that. It sounds good on paper. Again, in pure philosophy land, it sounds good. But in the real world, freedom has zero value unless you're secure. You can't care about freedom if you're dead. It makes little difference to you all the freedoms you have if you don't have any security. So security is actually more fundamental than freedom. It's more important for life and for organisms. Security comes first. Then freedom is a luxury. You're going to struggle to be a libertarian if you catch COVID-19, because it's going to kill you. See? To be a libertarian, you first have to be alive. So most libertarians today, what they do is they take their own privilege seriously for granted, which is why it's mostly young white males who tend to lean towards libertarianism more so than females or people of color, because females and people of color, they have more of a sense of their weaker position within society. They understand how easily they can be oppressed because they were in the past for long periods of time. They're physically weaker usually. They don't control the levers of power as much, in America at least. And so yeah, they clearly see that they need help. They need help from a benevolent government to regulate things and to equalize the playing field. They want a referee. You know who doesn't want a referee? The guy who's dominating the fucking field. Why would he need a referee? Because, hey, I'm beating everybody. I'm bullying everybody, so I don't need a referee. But that's super irresponsible to behave that way. That makes you an entitled bully. You're not really part of a community. You're acting highly selfishly. Let's see what else we have yet to cover. So much material here, but it's all real good. It's really, I think, drilling this material into your mind here. If you want the closest example of a real-world example of libertarianism in action, go look at Liberia or Somalia or the Congo. That's what anarchism looks like. That's what society and life looks like for people when they don't have a high-quality bureaucracy and infrastructure. No police, no courts, and so forth. In a sense, there's sort of a common trend between libertarians and communists. They're both utopian. They're both idealists. They both have these sort of lofty notions of how, like, yeah, all of us will just work together peacefully and coexist. No. It doesn't work because humans are fundamentally selfish. The problem with communism is that it assumes that people are going to be too selfless. They aren't that selfless enough. Communism might exist once people become super selfless, but it can't exist now. This is why it failed in Russia, for example. In practice in Russia, what happened was that they had the ideal of communism where we were all going to work in a co-op together, and no one's going to be the boss of anybody else, and we're going to all share in the spoils of our labor and all that. But in practice, what happened was that people were so selfish and so corrupt that it just, again, it devolved into syndicates and then pyramid-like power structures where one guy at the top, basically some mafia guy, took control of that part of society, and he got all the rewards, and everybody else was left high and dry. There's a very good reason why libertarian states don't exist. You might say, well, but Leo, what if we create a libertarian state? I've seen some like big billionaire libertarians actually come up with like stupid ideas like this, where they would say, oh, okay, we're going to buy an island somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and we're going to build the perfect libertarian state. It'll be maximum freedom. There'll be freedom of speech and freedom of this and freedom of that. If you actually do that, what's going to happen is that it's going to devolve into tribes, factions, syndicates, and mafias. That little society that you have, let's say you put 1,000 people on an island somewhere in the Pacific. There's no rules because everyone wants freedom. You can do whatever. You can have sex with whoever you want. You can, make money however you want, whatever. Eventually what happens is that because everybody is selfish there, they start acting out selfishly without any concern or regard for how their selfishness is impacting the selfishness or the feelings and the needs of other people. So they start exploiting each other. And then as individuals exploit each other more, they're going to combine into collectives, into syndicates. There will be factions. Eventually, factions will eat up other factions until, in the end, your island will just have two factions. the red faction, the blue faction. And these two factions will fight for each other. Whoever wins will dominate, slaughter the other faction. And that one faction, let's say the red faction wins, the red faction will then crown itself king. And it'll be a tyranny. And there will be no freedom. That's the reality of it. Another thing that libertarians don't have any clue about at all is developmental psychology. That's a deep topic. I have a lot to say about that, which I will in the future, but also I have in the past through my Spiral Dynamics series. Go check out all my videos on Spiral Dynamics. You basically need to really understand the problem with libertarianism and where libertarianism fits into the different stages of human development. But what libertarians misunderstand is that humans are fundamentally not all the same. We are at different levels of development. And these levels are very significant. Each developmental level corresponds with its own view of reality. Basically, each level is living in a different reality, in a sense. And society is composed of these different levels. There's also cognitive levels of development, moral levels, spiritual development, cultural development, and there's different states of consciousness that people are at. This creates an enormous amount of diversity, such that just because you as a libertarian might be at a relatively high level of development, that doesn't mean, like maybe morally, that doesn't mean that everybody else is. And of course, however high you are, there's much higher to go beyond where you currently are. And so basically, libertarianism is what's called the Spiral Dynamics stage orange level of development, cognitive development, and moral development. It's a pretty low stage. There's nothing unique about your libertarian philosophy. It's not intelligent. It's not wise. It's not special. It's extremely predictable. You've been infected with a mind virus from this Ayn Rand, Nathaniel Branden camp. And this is a popular mind virus that's going around American culture these days. It has for about 60 or 70 years. And it corresponds with the current stage of development of our culture and our society. And if you want, you can learn about higher levels that you can access. Part of my function here is to help you to access those higher levels, which you can. But in order to access those levels, you'd have to first admit that libertarianism is insufficient, that it's dysfunctional in many ways, that it's unhealthy, and that there's something better. But for that, you need to have an open mind, which of course most libertarians don't, which is why you're a libertarian to begin with. See? And by the way, Ayn Rand was a reactionary, ideological reactionary who was right at that perfect time in history where American society was making a transition from stage blue to orange. She grew up in Soviet communist Russia. She moved here. Soviet communist Russia was basically stage blue and red. She moved here. American society was still stage blue, moving into orange. She liked the capitalist system, the orange system, so she went all in and wrote several of these massive, pretentious novels about the value of individualism and moral responsibility and personal responsibility and fuck the collectivism and all that, because she was reacting against communism, understandable, but still reactionary. And so she was basically just parroting stage orange ideology. That's all that her books are. And there is some value in reading those books, but overall, they're way, what's it called? Overpraised, overappreciated, something like that. I'm forgetting the words. Yeah, so there's much better stuff out there. If you're taking Ayn Rand as your source of understanding of politics and human nature, you fucked up badly. Time to find better sources. All right, so there we go. That's basically what I wanted to communicate. Let me address a couple of objections that I know libertarians will have. Number one is that they will say, but Leo, just because a libertarian state has never existed in human history doesn't mean that it's impossible in the future. After all, for example, slavery existed, like you said, for thousands of years, and then it was abolished. And it seemed like slavery was impossible to abolish 200 years ago, and now here we are with no slavery. So Leo, why are you artificially limiting the potential of mankind by saying that a libertarian state will never be possible? Okay, that's an interesting objection. So my response to that is that actually in the very far distant future, if we're talking about thousands or 10,000 years from now, when humans will not even be recognizable as humans. We will have a totally different levels of consciousness, levels of development and cognition, everything, different technology, everything. In that very far distant future, maybe something like a loosening of regulations would be possible. Because people will be so conscious and so loving and so quote unquote good, inherently good. And to understand this, you would need to understand spirituality, which I can't explain here. But basically, I do foresee a future in the very far future where humans, or something that approximates humans, will be so loving and so conscious that they will not need very much of a government. If you've smoked DMT, if you've heard people talking about DMT entities or DMT aliens, the overwhelming reports about these entities or aliens are they're highly intelligent, highly evolved, conscious beings, which are way beyond humans or any other life form, which basically live in a separate dimension from this material one, and that they are so conscious and so loving that I would imagine that something like DMT entities, they don't need much of a government. Also, it matters how many of them there are. If there are like 7 billion DMT entities, they probably need some kind of government. If there are, if there are only handfuls of them, then they probably don't. So it depends. So in the future, if mankind, let's say mankind, stops reproducing so rapidly, and our population really shrinks in the future, where we build a society which is much less populated, then we can get away with smaller government. But it ain't going to happen in the next 100 years, so forget about it. It's completely impractical. We're nowhere near that. And also, just because slavery was abolished, society, I'm not saying society can't improve. Society is always improving. But you have to be careful about what you think will actually lead to more improvement or will actually lead to a de-evolution. You see, slavery, how was slavery abolished? It wasn't abolished through some sort of free market or some sort of libertarian philosophy. Slavery was abolished by forcefully forcing people who wanted to just have the freedom to own slaves, to forcing them to comply and to surrender that freedom. In a sense, we had to oppress slave owners to eliminate slavery. And you better believe that those slave owners felt very outraged that they were being oppressed. That's right. Those slave owners felt oppressed. They felt oppressed that somebody was trying to take away their slavery, because they didn't see slavery as bad or wrong. They saw slavery as just the natural condition of man and the natural prerogative of the white man. So how dare you take away the natural rights of a white man to own slaves? How dare you? That's their attitude. Another objection is that centralized federal planning is not needed. Our society can work without that through a more distributed system. Well, that's just not true. COVID-19 is a great counterexample there. COVID-19 is a problem that specifically benefits from strong centralized planning. And if you look at China's success, China has been one of the greatest economic successes in the last 60 years. They've had huge improvements to their levels of poverty. They have helped elevate millions of Chinese out of poverty into a middle-class sort of existence, more modernized level of existence. They've had a lot of success, and the reason that is because they had central federalized planning. And you see, one of the problems we might have as Americans is that if we don't have a strong central plan or a strong thing that we're working towards as a nation, we're just going to be sort of like a leaf blowing in the wind, not going in any particular direction, while our neighbors and adversaries will be using centralized federal planning to grow themselves rapidly and eventually outpace us and then defeat us. That is certainly a possibility. So, everything is evolutionary and it's all evolving, so the fittest will survive. And so it's a question of, what's gonna be more effective, to have strong central planning or to have a more distributed system. And don't just assume that a distributed system will automatically produce better results. That is an empirical test that needs to be run. That's not something you decide sitting in an armchair doing philosophy. Of course, there will be the objection from libertarians that, Leo, you're wrong. Objective morality and objective right and wrong truly exist. And the only thing I can tell you there is that no, it doesn't. If you really want to understand how morality works, I do have a few episodes about morality, understanding morality, how morality works. Go check those out. I'll also have more in the future. Check out my episode about relativity. I basically expect that you're intelligent enough to understand that if the Earth does not have an up and a down, because space, rotation in space is completely relative, there is no notion of up or down in space. If you can understand that, you should also be able to understand why your moral system is completely relative, and that there is no such thing as an objective right or an objective wrong. It's relative to what is good for you, or what is good for life, or what is good for mankind. To the extent that you say that mankind has some universal set of principles that we all agree on, that's still relative, still completely relative. It's not actually universal. By definition, it's human. It's not universal. Some aliens on some other planet will have a completely different system that they will call universal, which of course will not be universal. This is just an earthbound system at best. It's not even Earth. Even to call it Earth is already wrong because it excludes all the animals. It's a purely human system. And even there, still a lot of disagreement about right and wrong and moral systems within humans. We kill each other over that. And so yeah, there's nothing universal about it. To the extent that it's universal, we just say that, well, really, what it is it's sort of like, it's a set of principles that are maybe pro-life, or more accurately, pro-human life. So yeah, if we're saying that, okay, relative to our objective of creating peaceful societies, we can all agree that probably there shouldn't be rape, there shouldn't be murder, there shouldn't be genocide. Can we agree to that? Actually, we can't. Many people will still disagree and still want to do those things, but most of us can agree. And in that sense, we could say we have some sort of universal moral system, but it's completely relative. And these, even if we have these loose ideas, they're applied so hypocritically. We kill innocent people left and right through various kinds of programs, plans, military actions, war crimes, whatever. So this idea that we're all following some objective, universal set of principles, moral principles, this is childish. It's childish. It's not true. So investigate relativity more. Here's a list to conclude of solutions to libertarianism. So if you agree with the things I've said here, if you are now open-minded and you think that maybe you have been trapped into this ideology of libertarianism and you want to break free of it somehow, and you want some practical steps, here's what you can do. First of all, notice that it's a dogma. It's an ideology. Secondly, acknowledge that you cling to it, that you're emotionally attached to it. Then decide that you're going to let it go. That's going to take courage and fearlessness. Then you should stop consuming sources, ideological sources, that reinforce your right-wing libertarian ideology. You probably consume a lot of those sources because that's probably where you got it in the first place. So if you want to get rid of it, you got to get rid of the sources, upgrade your sources to better ones, non-ideological ones, non-libertarian ones. Find sources that challenge libertarian principles so you can get new perspectives. Of course, you're going to have to radically open your mind. I have episodes about open-mindedness. Go check those out. That will help you to open your mind and why it's so important. This will help you not only with politics and government, but with your personal life. Then you should start to contemplate, seriously contemplate, and think through real-world examples of how ego will exploit whatever political system or ideology you have. Ego is always going to be exploiting it, finding loopholes. Think through the consequences of your philosophy. How would it work in the real world, not just in your idealistic examples? Make sure you account for scale. Make sure you account for levels of development that people have, different levels. Make sure you don't assume that everyone is capable of responsibility and morality. That's not true at all. Assume that there are going to be sociopaths, psychopaths, narcissists, tyrants in your population who will want to take control. Account for relativity within your moral system. Don't assume that everyone's going to subscribe to your moral system. Don't assume that your moral system is the one true universal one, or that it's objective, or that anyone wants to even follow it. Acknowledge that the free market creates oppression. This is a fundamental feature of the free market. Acknowledge that you are part of a community, that you're not really an individual, and that you could not survive as an individual. Acknowledge all the luxuries that are afforded to you by being part of this community, and be grateful and thankful for them, so that you understand that your sacrifices of freedom are actually giving you something in return. Because if you think that you're sacrificing freedom and getting nothing, then yeah, you think that's a raw deal and you're pissed off about it. But if you see that you're sacrificing some freedom and you're getting much more freedom and other good stuff in return, then you will be content. Drop your clinging to individualism. Learn to be part of a community more. Go socialize more. Stop being some troll that lives in your mother's basement and just, does political commentary online. That's very unhealthy. Drop your clinging to freedom as an absolute good. Freedom is not an absolute good. You should be terrified of true freedom. You should be grateful for limitation and restriction. Study history more. A lot of your worldview simply comes from a lack of proper education and historical understanding. Study developmental psychology like spiral dynamics. Explore spiral dynamics stage green, which is the next stage above yours, which is a more socialistic stage, which of course you've demonized, so you don't want to explore it. See my episode called Spiral Dynamics Stage Green, which will help you to make that transition. Do consciousness work. Get into spirituality. I have lots of videos on the topic of spirituality, how to do it effectively and empirically. That will help to soften you up, help to open your mind, help to open your heart, help to develop empathy, compassion, and love. And ultimately, that's a huge missing component of the libertarian worldview. To be a libertarian, your heart has to be closed. You have to have very little compassion and empathy for humans. And fundamentally, you have to lack love. Because if you really were living from a position of love, you would start to realize the selfishness of your worldview and how really it's based in fear and clinging and ideology. And all of that will be fixed by doing spirituality and becoming more loving. Here's a list of final challenges, concrete governing problems that I'm going to give to you if you're a libertarian. If you still think that your libertarian philosophy is sufficient to govern a 21st century society, here are specific challenges in government that exist today which will make or break your whole worldview. Whatever political ideology or philosophy you have, it has to be able to handle the following challenges. First, ecology, environment, pollution, and climate change. And in general, this is called the problem of the tragedy of the commons. How do you construct a society or a community where nobody is individually responsible for the ecology or the environment? In the free market, everybody is incentivized to just pollute the rivers, the oceans, and so forth, and the atmosphere with no responsibility. There needs to be some sort of higher responsibility, higher collective agency which looks out for the entire ecology and not just for some one individual agent who's polluting in it. That's a huge problem for libertarians, and this is exactly why most libertarians will probably be in denial about climate change or environmental issues. They don't treat environmental issues seriously because if they did, they would realize libertarianism is bullshit. Another issue is systemic racism. Again, many libertarians would say that systemic racism doesn't exist, And the reason they say that is, of course, because if they acknowledge that it did exist, their libertarianism would have to fly out the window. And also because they're not systemic thinkers to begin with. They don't really think about society in terms of systemic problems. Another problem is hate speech, religious intolerance, ethnic wars, propaganda, cults, toxic ideologies, and tribalism. So how are you going to have a giant society with millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, without regulating hate speech, religious intolerance, ethnic warfare, propaganda, cults, toxic ideologies, and tribalism? If you don't moderate for these things, if you think that the free marketplace will just sort all of this out, you have no idea what you're talking about. The way that the free marketplace sorts out something like religious intolerance is that one religion fights another religion with a bloody war until one kills the other, or there's a genocide. That's not a solution here. We've already been through that. When you don't regulate speech, when you don't regulate thought, and you just let all sorts of toxic ideologies develop, cults will develop. Religions will develop, very toxic ones, which will then infect the minds of ignorant masses and then lead to all sorts of animosity, fear, and hatred of others, which will create tribalism and which will tear the entire community apart. So in a community, there needs to be something, some moderation or checks put in place to prevent the spread of toxic ideologies that demonize others and that create divisions within this larger unity that we call the United States. Another problem for you is corporate lobbying and bribery. How are you going to prevent large, powerful corporations from the free market from taking their money and bribing the government and corrupting the government with that until they take over the entire government and defeat all other corporations? We need regulations for that. How about corporate monopolies and capitalism as a whole? How do you deal with the problem of capitalism where monopolies become larger and larger and larger? Then they bribe the government more and more and more to corrupt it, to allow them to get even larger and larger and larger. How do you deal with that? Acknowledge that corporations are also oppressive, not just federal governments, because there's no democratic control over giant corporations. Also, here's another problem. How are you going to prevent a corporation from taking over the state? Because your libertarian ideology says that the state should be minimized, 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 minimized. Well, if you minimize it too much, what prevents the corporation from taking it over? If it can, it will. Don't expect on the good kind-heartedness of a corporation not to do it. You need to take into account cabals, syndicates, and mafias, how they form, and that they will necessarily form if you allow them to form and don't regulate them. You should take into account this problem of income inequality. How are you going to deal with ever-increasing income inequality between Americans? This is going to be a problem that gets worse and worse and worse under capitalism. What are you going to do to fix that? The free market is not going to fix it. The free market is going to make it worse. With the free market, the richest people will earn even more wealth, and the poorest people will get oppressed by the rich people. How are you going to deal with poverty, Social Security, and healthcare? These are issues that seem to be very difficult to fix through any kind of private system. Healthcare is a mafia. How are you going to fix it? How are you going to break it up? How are you going to regulate it to the benefit of most people? How are you going to deal with the problem of crippled people, sick people, and mentally ill people? People who are almost barely functional. These people cannot take any kind of responsibility. How are you going to deal with them? Are you just going to kill them? Are you just going to let them fend for themselves? Are you going to throw them out to the wolves in the woods and just let them do whatever they can? Or are you going to come up with some sort of compassionate system for them? And don't tell me that some free marketplace solution is going to help crippled people, sick people, and mentally ill people. It won't. These people don't have a lot of money. It's hard to extract money from them. So corporations are not going to be that interested in helping them. And don't tell me that some private charity work is going to solve this problem. It won't. If it could, it already would. How are we going to deal with terrorism? Terrorism is potentially a serious problem. Of course, oftentimes it's overblown by right-wingers, but it can be a serious problem. You know, it's possible for a terrorist to get a dirty bomb or even a nuclear weapon detonated in New York. Well, how are you going to stop that with libertarian policies? How are you going to stop nuclear weapons from proliferating and in general weapons of mass destruction? How can that be prevented with libertarian policies? Are you going to apply the free market principles here to nuclear weapons? Are you that stupid? How about larger potential problems? We could have more pandemics, even bigger, worse, more deadly, more virulent pandemics. How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to deal with something like an alien invasion or a meteor impact? Maybe an alien invasion is a little bit far-fetched, okay, but a meteor impact, that could certainly happen within our lifetimes. How are we going to prevent that? Are you going to leave that up to the free marketplace to solve that problem for you? Or are we going to all come together as a human species and work together to develop some sort of technology that will help to prevent some meteor impact in the future? Consider the possibility that other nations with good, strong central planning like China might significantly outpace America and then defeat America. How are you going to deal with that? So those are some things for you to consider. And also, one thing I forgot is, how are you going to deal with the increasing complexity, scale, population, interconnectedness, and globalization of our global community? The Earth is only going to become more global, more interconnected, more complex, with more people on it, at least in the foreseeable future. So how is your libertarian set of principles going to be able to handle that? All right, that's it. That's a long one. I'm dead tired. Whew. That's almost 4 hours of talking. I think that's the most I've ever done. All right, so please click that like button for me. I worked real hard on this one. Come check out Actualized.org. That's my website. You'll find the blog, the book list, a lot of good books on this topic there that you'll find. That'll help you to get your mind straight. You'll find the forum there. You can support me on patreon.com/actualized. Chip in a donation there if you'd like to keep the good content coming. The more supported I am there, the more I feel like I can share more stuff with you because I don't have to hold as much back for some sort of personal gain later on, and the less I have to feel like I have to sell out. That's it. I'm going to leave it here. I hope what you're realizing here is that government and politics is not just a waste of time. It is for many people, but it's not truly, because we live in a community, and to live in a community effectively, you have to understand how the community works. The problem we have right now is we have a lot of individualistic people living in an alienated society allowed by sort of the luxury and decadence that we've created for ourselves, who have an abysmally ignorant understanding of the realities and complexities of what community means, and even of the very value of a community, why it's even valuable or desirable to be part of one. Even that people are alienated from. And that's because we have a lot of these sort of stage orange ideologies. A lot of ideas about community have been turned into ideologies. It's the same problem as religion. You know, once you get the religious mind virus in there, it corrupts your whole thinking. You're not able to think straight. You're not able to contemplate, think independently for yourself. You're just parroting ideas. And that's exactly what libertarians are doing. And so hopefully we've helped to deconstruct that for you here and to do a little bit of a de-brainwashing. And if you'd like to learn more about my brand of politics and what I think the solutions are to many of these problems that I mentioned, some sort of positive vision, not just a critique, but a positive vision, not just a deconstruction. Go check out my 4-part series, a long series. I put a lot of work into it called Conscious Politics, parts 1, 2, 3, and 4, where I discuss in a lot of detail a political a set of political principle and understanding of politics which is not ideology-based, which integrates many of the rivaling factions that we see today, and gives you sort of a higher meta perspective. There's a lot of juicy insights there. So if you're looking for, what do I replace libertarianism with? Go check out that series, and you might find something that's different. It's not just another ideology like libertarianism, but my own. It's a meta thing. You'll see it's, it's something you'll have to discover for yourself.